Chapter 1. The Dream. Violet Potter lay flat on her back in bed, breathing hard as though she had been running. She had awoken from a vivid dream with a gasp of fear, the talons of which still had an icy grip on her heart. Something moved in the darkness beside her, and Harry, Violet's twin brother, sat up. In the faint, misty orange light that was filtering through the curtains from the street lamp outside their bedroom window, she could see that he was holding a hand to his forehead. "Harry," Violet whispered, and Harry dropped his hand at once. "Sorry," he said, just as quietly. "Didn't meant to wake you." Violet sat up in the narrow bed the two of them shared, supported by her elbows, and frowned at her brother. "Were you dreaming too?" she asked. "Yeah. Do you remember any of it?" Violet shook her head, and Harry sighed. She recoiled from the brightness when he clicked on the lamp on their bedside table and watched through narrowed eyes as Harry slipped his glasses onto his face. He scrambled out of bed, crossed the room, opened their wardrobe, and peered into the mirror on the inside of the door. Violet, worried now, tossed back the covers and got up to join him in the mirror. A pair of skinny 14-year-olds stared back at them. Violet was taller than Harry. Their whole lives they'd been the same height, up until last year when Violet had shot up like a beanstalk and now stood a good 4 inches above her brother. While their faces were very similar, the most identical thing about them were the bright green eyes they both shared. Harry's stared out from beneath a tangle of untidy black hair, sticking up at all angles and looking unruly no matter the occasion, while Violet's were just visible beneath the sharp line of fringe that covered her forehead. The haircut was new, and it hadn't been Violet's idea. It made her look like she had a particularly filthy mop trying to eat her head when left to its own devices. Unfortunately, it was no longer long enough for Violet to pull it back into the short braid she was used to wearing. But hair wasn't the only thing that set the twins' faces apart. Slowly, over the last year, their features had started growing more distinct from one another. The soft roundness of youth had been replaced by the awkward angles of adolescence, and both of them found their noses were suddenly too large for their faces. Harry's jaw had widened, while Violet's had lengthened, giving her chin the sharp and unpleasant quality of a hatchet. Harry's ears stuck out horrendously. Spots had popped up on their tan faces, which had both become so oily that they practically gleamed in direct sunlight. But the most distinctive difference of all was that Harry had a scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning, which he was currently prodding at with a worried expression on his face. "You really can't remember anything," he said abruptly, his eyes finding Violet's in the mirror. Again, Violet shook her head, but concentrated hard nonetheless, trying to recall anything from the dream before she had awoken. It had seemed so real. The dim picture of a darkened room came to her. There had been a snake on the hearth rug, a small man called Peter, nicknamed Wormtail, and a cold, high voice, the voice of Lord Voldemort. Violet felt as though an ice cube had slipped down into her belly at the very thought. "There was an old man," Violet said slowly, doing her best to remember, "and a chair." There was something horrible sitting in the chair. "Wormtail was there, I think," Harry muttered. He was still watching her in the mirror, rubbing idly at his scar. "And did you hear that voice?" Violet nodded. "I heard him," she whispered. "Talking about someone they'd killed, him and Wormtail, and someone they were going to kill." "Me," said Harry, finally dropping his hand to his side. His mouth was set in a grim line. "They were talking about killing me." Violet shuddered. She couldn't help it. Her arms came up to wrap around herself despite the lack of chill, and looked away from her brother's eyes, focusing instead on the room around them. She stared around as thought, expecting to see something unusual there, some sort of sign that the dream had been more than just a dream. As it happened, there were an extraordinary number of unusual things in this room. A large wooden trunk was pushed up beneath the window, and another stood open at the foot of the bed, revealing a cauldron, a broomstick, black robes, and assorted spellbooks. Rolls of parchment littered the part of the desk that was not taken up by the large, empty cage in which Harry's pet owl, Hedwig, was usually perched. On the floor beside the bed, a book lay open. Violet had been reading it before she fell asleep last night. The pictures in this book were all moving. Glowing eyes leered out from shadowy illustrations, and gnarled claws and tentacles inched their way across the margins, as though reaching for the fingers of the unwary reader. Violet walked over to the book, picked it up, and watched a drawing of a three-headed snake hiss menacingly up at her. Then she snapped the book shut. After such a horrible dream, now was not the time to dwell on the beasts and monsters that so often held her fascination. She placed the book on the nightstand and sat, watching her brother pace to the window. After glancing briefly out at Privet Drive, Harry came and sat down beside her on the bed, looking troubled. He was still rubbing at his forehead. Violet knew it wasn't the pain that bothered him. Harry was the strongest person she knew, and no stranger to pain and injury. He had lost all the bones in his right arm once, and had them painfully regrown in a night. The same arm had been pierced by a venomous foot-long fang not long afterward, from the mouth of the same basilisk that had petrified Violet. And only last year Harry had fallen 50 feet from an airborne broomstick. The two of them were used to bizarre accidents and injuries. They were unavoidable if you attended Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and had a knack for attracting a lot of trouble. So if the pain wasn't troubling him, that meant it was something else. "How bad is it?" "What?" Harry said distractedly. "Your scar. You've been prodding at it since we woke up. Is it bad?" Harry dropped his hand at once and said, "It's fine. Don't worry about it, Romans 6. "Of course I'm worried about it. About you. It hasn't hurt for a long time, has it? So why's it bothering you now?" "I don't know," Harry said defensively. "The last time my scar hurt it was because Voldemort was nearby, but it's not like he can be hurt." A heavy silence fell between them, and Violet found herself listening intently. Was she half expecting to hear a creak of a stair or the swish of a cloak? And then both of them jumped slightly as they heard their cousin Dudley give a tremendous grunting snore from the next room. Violet and Harry looked at each other with wide, anxious eyes, and then they both smiled sheepishly, embarrassed by how easily they'd been spooked. There was no one in the house with them except for Aunt Petunia and Dudley, and they were plainly still asleep, their dreams untroubled and painless. Things at Privet Drive were not as they once were. The Dursleys were the Potter twins, only living relatives. They were muggles, and up until recently had behaved as though magic were an affront to their very way of life, which meant that Harry and Violet were about as welcome in the house as dry rot. Their first 10 years of life with the Dursleys were spent in misery, while their cousin Dudley was spoiled rotten, held up on a pedestal, and allowed to do whatever he wanted. The twins were treated as little better than servants at best, or vermin at worst. Rather than the second-floor bedroom that they shared now, the two of them had been forced to live and sleep in the cupboard under the stairs. They were denied meals, pushed, pulled, and slapped whenever they misbehaved, and otherwise treated as though they did not exist. Things were still far from perfect, but life at number 4 had improved greatly now that Uncle Vernon was no longer in the picture. He had been driven from the house the summer before due, in part to Aunt Petunia's shocking display of personal initiative, and partly due to the fact that Violet had accidentally blown up his sister at the dinner table. It was an ugly, difficult affair that the neighbors took great pleasure in watching through the gaps in their curtains. Uncle Vernon no longer lived with his son and soon-to-be ex-wife. He was renting a flat in London, close to his work, and only showed up every other weekend to take Dudley out to the cinema or the arcade or wherever else it was that Dudley wanted to go. Aunt Petunia, meanwhile, had begun to grudgingly tolerate the twins. Magic and anything associated with Hogwarts was still frowned upon, but unlike Uncle Vernon, who would have thrown a fit and begun screaming at them, Aunt Petunia preferred to turn a blind eye whenever she walked in on Harry and Violet doing their homework, with feather quills and parchment, in the middle of her spotless kitchen. Though their tenuous new relationship with Aunt Petunia wasn't hostile, they still weren't close by any stretch of the imaginating. Neither Violet nor Harry had been able to confide in their aunt about anything before. particularly about their life in the wizarding world. The very idea of going to her when she awoke and telling her about Harry's scar hurting and about their worries about Voldemort was laughable. And yet it was because of Voldemort that Harry and Violet had come to live with the Dursleys in the first place. If it hadn't been for Voldemort, Harry would not have had the lightning scar on his forehead. If it hadn't been for Voldemort, the twins would still have had their parents. Harry and Violet had been a year old the night that Voldemort, the most powerful dark wizard for a century, a wizard who'd been gaining power steadily for 11 years, arrived at their house and killed their father and mother. Voldemort had then turned his wand on Harry. He had performed the curse that had disposed of many full-grown witches and wizards in his steady rise to power, and incredibly, it had not worked. Instead of killing the small boy, the curse had rebounded upon Voldemort. Harry had survived with nothing but a lightning-shaped cut on his forehead. Violet was completely unharmed, and Voldemort had been reduced to something barely alive. His powers gone, his life almost extinguished, Voldemort had fled. The terror in which the secret community of witches and wizards had lived for so long had lifted, Voldemort's followers had disbanded, and Harry and Violet Potter had become famous. It had been enough of a shock for the two of them to discover, on their 11th birthday, that they were wizards. It had been even more disconcerting to find out that everyone in the hidden wizarding world knew their name. Violet and Harry had arrived at Hogwarts to find that heads turned and whispers followed them wherever they went. But they were used to it now. At the end of this summer, they would be starting their 4th year at Hogwarts, and both of them were already counting the days until they would be back at the castle again. But there was still a fortnight to go before they went back to school. Violet looked fitfully around their room again, and her eye paused on the pile of birthday cards that had been sent to them by their friends. She was about to suggest that Harry write to his best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, about his scar hurting, but knew at once that he wouldn't agree. Hermione would worry and recommend a book to consult, and Ron would likely panic and tell his whole family about it in an attempt to give advice. But there were other people that Harry could write to. Albus Dumbledore was the headmaster of Hogwarts and wisest person Harry and Violet had ever known. Surely he would have an answer for why Harry's scar could be hurting in the middle of an otherwise normal night. Harry, however, was not keen on the idea. "What would I write to him, Violet?" he said when she voiced her suggestion. "Dear Professor Dumbledore, sorry to bother you, but my scar hurt this morning. Yours sincerely, Harry Potter." "It was just an idea. You don't have to be an arse about it," Violet said, slightly stung. She gnawed her bottom lip and then said, "What about writing to Professor Lupin?" Harry scrunched up his face uncomfortably. "I don't want to bother him either. Besides, he's Siergard Father, not mine. Remember Romans 6. Remus Lupin was Violet's godfather, but he had also spent the previous year teaching defense against the dark arts classes at Hogwarts, and was sure to know something that could be helpful." But again, Violet could see the wariness on her brother's face as he shut down another of her ideas. This time at least Violet knew she deserved it. After all, he was throwing her own words back in her face. "He's my godfather, Harry, not yours," Violet had said hotly only 2 weeks before the day after their shared birthday. Violet had received a long letter from Professor Lupin apologizing that he'd been unable to come and visit them. Their birthday happened to fall on the night of the full moon, and Lupin, as had come to light over the course of the previous year, was a werewolf. A completely normal and very kind man for the rest of the month. On each full moon he transformed into a nightmarish beast of fur and claws, a mindless monster with no memory of his human self. It was his condition that had caused him to retreat from Violet and Harry's lives after their parents were murdered. Lupin was afraid that his presence would complicate things for them at best and downright endanger them at worst. It had been an extremely hard pill for Violet in particular to swallow at first. After years of being abused and neglected by the Dursleys, it was painful to learn that there was someone else out there who was meant to be looking out for her, but had chosen not to. She had forgiven Professor Lupin, however, and was now determined to enjoy as much of his company as possible. That was going to be a lot easier to do now that she knew for certain he would be teaching at Hogwarts for another year. He wouldn't be teaching defense against the dark arts any longer, however. A permission form had been included with his letter for students to attend his new and experimental elective class, Beings and Beasts. As Violet was his goddaughter, Lupin had taken the liberty of signing her permission slip himself. Her hurtful words had come out after Harry expressed disappointment that Lupin had only included him in a brief postscript, until Harry I said happy birthday as well, while the bulk of the letter was addressed mainly to Violet. She knew, of course, that she was wrong to have said that. But it did nothing to wash away the sense of possessive pride Violet felt toward Lupin. He was her godfather, and hers alone. She'd never had something all to herself before. How could she be expected not to be a little selfish about it? And it wasn't like Harry was all on his own, either. He had a godfather as well. "Well, write to Sirius, then," Violet said. "You told me he was able to get letters now, and I know he'd love to hear from you, Harry." Harry's expression brightened at once, like a light bulb had gone off in his head. "Yeah," he said excitedly. "Of course I can write to Sirius. I can't believe I forgot." Violet smiled sadly as Harry leapt up from the bed, hurried across the room, and sat down at the desk. It wasn't unusual that Harry wouldn't have thought about Sirius straight away after all. He had only found out that Sirius was his godfather 2 months ago. The reason for Sirius' complete absence from Harry and Violet's lives was even more complicated than Professor Lupin's Sirius had been in Azkaban, the terrifying wizard prison guarded by creatures called Dementors, sightless, soul-sucking fiends who had come to search for Sirius at Hogwarts when he had escaped. But Sirius had been innocent. The murders for which he had been convicted were committed by Peter Pettigrew, also called Wormtail, Voldemort's supporter, whom everyone had believed dead for 12 years. The truth came to light only the previous year, though Wormtail had managed to escape from custody before he could be taken in by the Ministry of Magic. For one glorious hour, Harry and Violet had believed that they were leaving the Dursleys at last, because Sirius had offered them a home once his name had been cleared. Wormtail's escape had complicated matters, but there were enough witnesses of his survival to throw doubt on the validity of Sirius's conviction. How could a man be guilty of a murder if the supposed victim was still alive? Sirius Black was now currently facing a proper trial, something he'd never had before, and well on his way to exoneration. His face was once again on the cover of the wizarding newspaper, the Daily Prophet, but he was no longer shown as a filthy, screaming madman. The years in Azkaban may have ravaged his former good looks, but he had been cleaned up and dressed finely, and something of the handsome young man he used to be now shown through the gaunt face and dark, sunken eyes. His alleged innocence was proving to be something of a scandal for the ministry, and Violet took great pleasure in reading through the articles decrying the lack of fair trial 12 years ago, the shoddy evidence that led to his conviction, and the horrific imprisonment of an innocent man. Both Harry and Violet had written several letters to Sirius since they had been back at Privet Drive, but only in the last week had he been given the freedom to write back. He was being treated well, far better than he had ever been treated in the last 12 years, and was very hopeful and excited to have his name cleared at last. With Dumbledore testifying on his behalf, the public opinion on him had shifted drastically. With Harry busy scribbling away and a few precious hours left before sunrise, Violet flopped backward onto the bed and allowed her eyes to fall shut. The icy fear that had woken her in the first place had subsided at last, and the haze of sleep was quickly beginning to fill her mind. Violet didn't wake again until several hours later, when Harry was finally sending Hedwig off with his letter to Sirius. By the time Harry and Violet arrived in the kitchen, Aunt Petunia and Dudley were already seated at the table. Neither of them looked up as the twins entered or sat down. Aunt Petunia was cutting a grapefruit into quarters, her lips pursed over her prominent teeth. Dudley looked furious and sulky, and somehow seemed to be taking up even more space than usual. This was saying something, as he always took up an entire side of the square table by himself. When Aunt Petunia put a quarter of unsweetened grapefruit onto Dudley's plate with a tremulous, "There you are, Diddy darling," Dudley glowered at her. His life had taken a most unpleasant turn in more ways than one since the summer began. Dudley was deeply unhappy that Uncle Vernon was no longer living with them. Though never particularly close with his father, at least as far as Violet had seen, Uncle Vernon had always allowed Dudley to get away with most anything, especially when it came to terrorizing the Potters. Now that things were different in the house, as Aunt Petunia liked to say, his regular bullying and harassment of Harry and Violet was no longer permitted, at least within his mother's line of sight. With his favorite punching bags now off limits and nowhere to redirect his taste for unkindness, Dudley had taken to punching things around the house. Walls, doors, pillows, the sofa, the microwave, the television, anything that he could reasonably slam his fist into without hurting himself was now dented. 3 days ago, Aunt Petunia had gone out and bought him aerial punching bag, and the sound of him doing his best to pound the stuffing out of it at all hours of the day had become a sort of background noise. In addition to stopping him from breaking the rest of the house, the punching bag also provided Dudley with something he had been sorely lacking in his life: exercise. Accompanying the low marks and accusations of bullying laid out in his school report, there were also a few well-chosen comments from the school nurse that not even Aunt Petunia could ignore or explain away. No matter how much she wailed that Dudley was big-boned, and that his poundage was really puppy fat, and that he was a growing boy who needed plenty of food, the fact remained that the school outfitters didn't stock knickerbockers big enough for him anymore. The school nurse had seen what Aunt Petunia's eyes so sharp when it came to spotting fingerprints on her gleaming walls, and in observing the comings and goings of the neighbors simply refused to see. That far from needing extra nourishment, Dudley had reached roughly the size and weight of a young killer whale. So after many tantrums, after arguments that shook the twins' bedroom floor, and many tears from Aunt Petunia, the new regime had begun. The diet sheet that had been sent by the smelting school nurse had been taped to the fridge, which had been emptied of all of Dudley's favorite things: fizzy drinks and cakes, chocolate bars and burgers, and filled instead with fruit and vegetables, and the sorts of things that Uncle Vernon would have called rabbit food. To make Dudley feel better about it all, Aunt Petunia had insisted that the whole family followed the diet too. She now passed a grapefruit quarter each to Harry and Violet. They noticed that theirs were a lot smaller than Dudley's. Aunt Petunia had yet to let go of, and likely never would, the long-standing habit of treating the twins like second-class citizens compared to her precious son. She seemed to feel that the best way to keep up Dudley's morale was to make sure that he did, as usual, get to eat more than Harry and Violet. But Aunt Petunia didn't know what was hidden under the loose floorboard upstairs. She had no idea that the twins were not following the diet at all. The moment Harry had got wind of the fact that they were expected to survive the summer on carrot sticks, he had sent Hedwig to his friends with pleas or help, and they had risen to the occasion magnificently. Hedwig had returned from Hermione's house with a large box stuffed full of sugar-free snacks. Hermione's parents were dentists. Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, had obliged with a sack full of his own homemade rock cakes. Harry hadn't touched these, but Violet found they were rather good after being liberally dunked in tea. Mrs. Weasley, however, had sent the family owl, Errol, with an enormous fruitcake and assorted meat pies. Poor Errol, who was elderly and feeble, had needed a full 5 days to recover from the journey. And then on the twins' birthday, which the Dursleys had completely ignored, they had received no less than 6 birthday cakes, one each from Ron, Hermione, Hagrid, Lupin, and Violet's best friends Tracy Davis and Cassius Warrington. The doorbell rang. Aunt Petunia leapt to her feet and set off down the hall. Quick as a flash, while his mother was out of the room, Dudley reached across the table and snatched Violet's grapefruit right off her plate. Violet shot him the dirtiest look she could manage and pushed the now empty plate away from her. There was talking at the door and someone laughing, and Aunt Petunia's high, nervous, false laughter in response. Then the door closed, and their aunt's sharp footsteps carried her back into the kitchen. Her mouth was pinched into a tight line of displeasure. "You've been sent a letter," she said curtly to Harry, who flinched back in surprise as an envelope was thrust into his face. Violet took one look at it and had to fight back a laugh of her own. Every bit of it was covered in stamps, except for a square inch on the front, into which the Dursleys' address had been squeezed in minute writing. "Is that from Ron?" Violet asked, peering over as Harry eagerly tore into the envelope. He read quickly, his face lighting up more and more with every line. "It's from Ransmum," he said at last, holding up the bright purple paper so that Violet could see Mrs. Weasley's signature. "She says we're invited to the Quidditch World Cup with them on Monday, and we could stay with them for the rest of the holidays." Violet and Harry now wore matching grins of excitement on their faces and looked quickly to Aunt Petunia. "Can we go?" they said in unison. A slight spasm crossed Aunt Petunia's bony face, her lips going so impossibly thin they threatened to disappear entirely. "Let me see that," she said, snatching the letter back out of Harry's hand to read for herself. "Who is this woman?" "You've seen her," said Harry. "She's my friend Ron's mother. She was meeting him off the school train at the end of last term." He had almost said Hogwarts Express, and that was a sure way to get their aunt to shut down. Even now, nobody ever mentioned the name of the twins' school aloud in the Dursley household. "Dumpy sort of woman," said Aunt Petunia, squinting distastefully at the signature on the bottom of the page. "Load of children with red hair," Violet frowned. She thought it was a bit rich of Aunt Petunia to call anyone dumpy, when her own son, Dudley, had finally achieved what he'd been threatening to do since the age of 3, and become wider than he was tall. "Quidditch," Aunt Petunia muttered, rereading the letter once more. "That's that sport, isn't it? The one that's all up in the air." Harry and Violet shared a look of surprise. It was difficult to remember that their aunt had grown up with a witch for a sister, their mother, Lily, and knew far more about the magical world than she would ever let on. Sometimes they wondered exactly how much knew, though neither had ever dared to broach the subject with her even on the best of days. "Yeah," said Harry finally, blinking away his surprise. "The one I play." Aunt Petunia gave him a sharp sort of look, then dropped her eyes back to the parchment. Her fingers were now white as she held it. "What does she mean, the normal way?" she spat. "Normal for us," said Harry, and quickly added, "You know, Owl Post, that's what's normal for wizards." On the other side of the table, Dudley choked on his third piece of stolen grapefruit. Aunt Petunia looked as outraged as if Harry had just uttered a disgusting swear word. Shaking with anger, she threw the letter back into his hands and rounded the table, thumping Dudley soundly on the back as she sputtered and coughed. "Now look what you've done," Aunt Petunia cried, smoothing back Dudley's thatch-colored hair from his now bright red forehead. "Don't worry now, Diddy. They won't say it again. It's all right." Violet kicked her brother beneath the table, the glare on her face making her message plain. Would he go and do a thing like that for? But Harry only shrugged half-heartedly and turned his attention back to Aunt Petunia. "So can we go, then?" he asked casually. Aunt Petunia's expression was sour, but Violet thought she knew exactly what sort of battle was raging behind her eyes. Allowing the twins to go would make them happy, something that Aunt Petunia had struggled against for 13 years. On the other hand, allowing the two of them to disappear to the Weasleys for the rest of the summer would get them out of the house 2 weeks earlier than anyone could have hoped. As neither Dudley nor Aunt Petunia enjoyed having Harry and Violet around, the answer seemed natural. "Fine. You can go to this World Cup thing. You write and tell these people there to pick you up, mind. I haven't got time to go dropping you off all over the country, and you're to spend the rest of the summer there if they'll have you." "Okay," said Harry brightly. He tapped Violet's stunned shoulder, and the two of them hopped to their feet. Violet followed her brother back upstairs to their bedroom, holding back the excited whoop building in her chest. They were going to the Quidditch World Cup. They were going to the Weasleys. While Ron was Harry's best friend, Violet was far closer with his younger sister, Ginny, and his older twin brothers, Fred and George. She was also immensely fond of Mrs. Weasley and couldn't wait to spend the next 2 weeks feasting on her delicious home cooking. "Hedwig's back," said Harry excitedly as he flung open their bedroom door. His snowy owl was indeed back, sitting in her cage, staring at Harry with her enormous amber eyes, and clicking her beak in a way that Violet had come to learn meant that she was annoyed about something. Exactly what was annoying her became apparent almost at once. "Ouch," said Violet, as what appeared to be a small, grey, feathery tennis ball collided with the side of her head. Violet massaged the spot furiously, looking up to see what had hit her, and saw a minute owl, small enough to fit into the palm of her hand, whizzing excitedly around the room like a loose firework. Harry stooped quickly at her feet and came back up holding another letter. "It's from Ron," he said brightly, tearing into the envelope at once. "Ha, he's letting us know they've got the tickets," and Harry squinted hard at the parchment. "He says the owl's called Pig, and Hermione will be coming too. That's brilliant." Violet smiled tightly. Of course, both of Harry's best friends would be there. Ron was unavoidable, as it was his family, but the Weasleys had always been exceedingly generous when it came to Hermione Granger as well. Part of Violet wished that they could have been just as generous toward at least one of her friends, too. The small owl flitted low over her head again, twittering madly. Violet's hand shot out and gently wrapped around the little ball of feathers. It let out a loud hoot of surprise, then settled down and began to vibrate in her hands. Violet had never seen a stranger creature and fell immediately in love with it. There was a growl from somewhere by her ankles, and Violet looked down to find Crookshanks, her enormously fluffy orange cat, staring up at her hands with wide, focused eyes. Violet knelt down and carefully held the owl out for Crookshanks to sniff. "What do you reckon, Crooks?" she asked seriously. "Definitely an owl." When it had come to light the year before that Wormtail had been living in his animagus form as Ron's pet rat, Scabbers, everyone had looked at Crookshanks' hostility towards Scabbers in a new light. He'd seen right through Wormtail's disguise from the very start. But now he pressed his squashed little nose up against the little owl's feathers, sniffing curiously, and began to purr. Crookshanks looked up at Violet with his great orange eyes and blinked once. Violet reckoned that meant Pig was all right. "Cool," she said, and stood up to carry the little owl over to Hedwig's cage. She placed it on top, where Hedwig looked coldly up at it, as though daring it to try and come any closer. Violet looked around and found Harry back at the desk, scribbling hastily. "Hooray, you writing to now?" "Ron, to let him know we can come," Harry said without looking up, "and Sirius, so he knows where to write back to me." "Can you send one to Remus as well?" Violet asked lightly. Harry nodded and reached for another piece of parchment. "I'll have Hedwig take these two and send Pig back to Ron." "Thanks, Harry. What sort of cake do you want? Can I have some more of the one Tracy sent, actually?" "It was really good." Violet grinned as she crawled under the bed, wrenched up the loose floorboard, and pulled out 2 large chunks of birthday cake. She passed one to Harry and sat there on the floor eating the other, savoring the happiness that was flooding through her. She had cake, and Dudley had nothing but grapefruit. It was a bright summer's day, and they would be leaving Privet Drive tomorrow. She would get to be surrounded by Weasleys and was going to watch the Quidditch World Cup. It was hard, just now, to feel worried about anything, even Lord Voldemort. Chapter 2. Back to the Burrow. By 12 o'clock the next day, Harry and Violet's trunks were packed with their school things, and all their most prized possessions. Harry had his invisibility cloak, inherited from their father, and the broomstick he had gotten from Sirius, while Violet had her collection of interesting jewelry and the enchanted map of Hogwarts that had been given to the two of them by Fred and George Weasley last year. Technically, it belonged to both and Harry, but Violet had won it fair and square in their ensuing scuffle. She had emptied the hiding place under the loose floorboard of all food. and Harry had taken down the chart on the wall, counting down the days to September the 1st, on which he liked to cross off the days remaining until their return to Hogwarts. The atmosphere inside number 4, Privet Drive, was extremely tense. The imminent arrival at their house of an assortment of wizards was making Aunt Petunia uptight and irritable. She had looked downright alarmed when Harry and Violet informed her that the Weasleys would be arriving at 5 o'clock the very next day. Aunt Petunia had been straightening things all day. She went around the living room no less than 7 times, dusting off the mantelpiece and the picture frames on the wall, adjusting the delicate lace doilies that sat on the back of the sofa and every chair, squinting around looking for any stray specks of dust that dared accumulate in her spotless home. To some people, this might have looked like a gesture of welcome, but Violet knew it was because Aunt Petunia was determined to have something completely under her control, even if it was only one room of the house. This explained her uncharacteristic shortness with Dudley as well. Dudley was, plainly, terrified. He had emerged from his last encounter with a fully grown wizard with a curly pig's tail poking out of the seat of his trousers, and Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had had to pay for its removal at a private hospital in London. It wasn't altogether surprising, therefore, that Dudley kept running his hand nervously over his backside and walking sideways from room to room so as not to present the same target to the enemy, ruffling his neatly pressed clothes in the process. Lunch was an almost silent meal. Dudley didn't even protest at the food, cottage cheese and grated celery. Aunt Petunia wasn't eating at all. Her arms were folded, her lips pursed, and she seemed to be chewing her tongue, as though biting back the furious diatribe she'd worked up during her morning cleaning fit. "They'll be driving, won't they?" she snapped suddenly across the table. Said Harry and Violet, looking at one another. They hadn't thought of that. How were the Weasleys going to pick them up? They didn't have a car anymore. The old Ford Anglia they had once owned was currently running wild in the forbidden forest at Hogwarts. But Mr. Weasley had borrowed a Ministry of Magic car last year. Possibly he would do the same today. "I think so," said Harry. The twins spent most of the afternoon in their bedroom. Violet couldn't stand watching Aunt Petunia peer out through the net curtains every few seconds, as though there had been a warning about an escaped rhinoceros. Finally, at 4:45, Harry and Violet went back downstairs and into the living room. Aunt Petunia was back to compulsively straightening things. This time it was the cushions. Dudley was crammed into an armchair, his porky hands beneath him, clamped firmly over his bottom. Violet sat stiffly in the middle of the sofa, not daring to lean back and disturb the perfectly placed cushions. Harry, unable to stand the tension, had left the room and gone to sit on the stairs in the hall. But 5 o'clock came and then went. Aunt Petunia, mouth pinched tighter than ever, yanked back the curtains, peered up and down the street, then pulled them shut again with a sharp jerk. "They're late," she snapped at Violet. "I know," said Violet. "Maybe the traffic's bad or something." 5:10. Then 5:15. Violet's anxiety was slowly ramping up with every second that ticked past. Her leg bounced nervously, keeping time with Aunt Petunia's short, sharp little steps as she paced the living room. "No consideration at all," she was muttering. "And if they think for a moment, they'll be invited to dinner if they're late." Violet, unwisely, opened her mouth to snap back at Aunt Petunia, but fortunately didn't get the chance to get any words out. There was a sudden rumble, followed by a muffled whoosh and a loud bang from somewhere inside the wall. Dudley yelled and leapt out of his seat, waddling quickly into the hall. Another whoosh and bang, and Violet leapt from her seat as well, breathing hard as she stared at the boarded-up fireplace, which had a fake coal fire plugged in front of it. Were those voices? She whipped around as Harry skidded into the room, looking frantically for the source of the noise. "What happened?" he said. "What's the matter?" The loud banging and scrapings were now unmistakably joined by voices coming from inside the wall. "Ouch! Fred, no, go back, go back. There's been some kind of mistake. Tell George not to ouch." "George, no, there's no room. Go back quickly and tell Ron. Maybe they can hear us. Dad, maybe they'll be able to let us out. There was a loud hammering of fists on the boards behind the electric fire, and Aunt Petunia let out a weak wail. "What is this?" she cried, rounding on the twins. "What's going on?" They've tried to get here by flue powder," said Violet, fighting a mad desire to laugh. "They can travel by fire, only Uncle Vernon blocked up the fireplace. Hang on." She approached the fireplace and called through the boards. "Mr. Weasley." "Can you hear me?" The hammering stopped. Somebody inside the chimney piece said, "SHH. Mr. Weasley, it's Violet. The fireplace has been blocked up. You won't be able to get through there." "Damn," said Mr. Weasley's voice. "What on earth did they want to block up the fireplace for?" "They've got an electric fire," Violet explained. "Really?" said Mr. Weasley's voice excitedly. "Eclectic, you say? With a plug? Gracious, I must see that. Let's think." "Ouch, Ron." Ron's voice now joined the others. "What are we doing here? Has something gone wrong?" "Oh no, Ron," came Fred's voice very sarcastically. "No, this is exactly where we wanted to end up." "Yeah, we're having the time of our lives here," said George, whose voice sounded muffled, as though he was squashed against the wall. Boys, said Mr. Weasley vaguely. "I'm trying to think what to do. Yes, only way. Stand back, Violet." Violet hurried away from the fireplace to stand by Aunt Petunia. She just made it to the sofa when bang. The electric fire shot across the room as the boarded-up fireplace burst outward, expelling Mr. Weasley, Fred, George, and Ron in a cloud of rubble and loose chippings. Aunt Petunia shrieked and fell backward over the coffee table. Violet caught her before she hit the floor and gaped, speechless, at the Weasleys, all of whom had bright red hair, including Fred and George, who were identical to the last freckle. "That's better," panted Mr. Weasley, brushing dust from his long green robes and straightening his glasses. "Ah, you must be Harry and Violet's aunt." Tall, thin, and balding, he moved toward Aunt Petunia, his hand outstretched, but Aunt Petunia backed away several paces, pulling out of Violet's grasp. Words utterly failed Aunt Petunia. Her lovely dress was covered in white dust, which had settled in her hair and made her look as though she had just aged 30 years. Yes, sorry about that," said Mr. Weasley, lowering his hand and looking over his shoulder at the blasted fireplace. "It's all my fault. It just didn't occur to me that we wouldn't be able to get out at the other end. I had your fireplace connected to the flue network, you see, just for an afternoon, so we could come and get the twins. Muggle fireplaces aren't supposed to be connected, strictly speaking, but I've got a useful contact at the flue regulation panel, and he fixed it for me. I can put it right in a jiffy, though, don't worry. I'll light a fire to send the children back, and then I can repair your fireplace before I disapparate." Violet was willing to bet that Aunt Petunia hadn't understood a single word of this. She was still gaping at Mr. Weasley, pale and thunderstruck. "Hello, Violet, Harry," said Mr. Weasley brightly, beaming at them. "Got your trunks ready?" "They're upstairs," said Harry, grinning back. "We'll get them," said Fred at once. Winking at Violet, he and George left the room. They knew where Harry and Violet's bedroom was, having once rescued them from it in the dead of night. "Well," said Mr. Weasley, swinging his arms slightly, while he tried to find words to break the very nasty silence. Very nice place you've got here." As the usually spotless living room was now covered in dust and bits of brick, this remark didn't go down well with Aunt Petunia. She started chewing on her tongue again, yet seemed too scared to actually say anything. Mr. Weasley was looking around. He loved everything to do with Muggles. Violet could see him itching to go and examine the television and the video recorder. "They run on electricity, do they?" he said knowledgeably. "Ah, yes, I can see the plugs. I collect plugs," he added to Aunt Petunia. "And batteries. Got a very large collection of batteries. My wife thinks I'm mad, but there you are." Aunt Petunia clearly, though Mr. Weasley was mad too. She moved a half-step backward, holding a hand to her thin chest, as though covering her frantically beating heart. Dudley suddenly reappeared in the room. Violet could hear the clunk of her and Harry's trunks on the stairs, and knew that the sounds had scared Dudley out of the kitchen. Dudley edged along the wall, gazing at Mr. Weasley with terrified eyes, and attempted to conceal himself behind his mother. Unfortunately, as Aunt Petunia was about as big around as a sapling, she provided him little to no cover. "Ah, this is your cousin, is it, Harry?" said Mr. Weasley, taking another brave stab at making conversation. "Yep," said Harry, "that's Dudley." He and Ron exchanged glances and then quickly looked away from each other. They were clearly choking back laughter. Dudley was still clutching his bottom as though afraid it might fall off. Mr. Weasley, however, seemed genuinely concerned at Dudley's peculiar behavior. Indeed, from the tone of his voice when he next spoke, Violet was quite sure that Mr. Weasley thought Dudley was quite as mad as the Dursleys thought he was, except that Mr. Weasley felt sympathy rather than fear. "Having a good holiday, Dudley," he said kindly. Dudley whimpered. Violet saw his hands tighten still harder over his massive backside. Fred and George came back into the room, each pulling one of the twins' school trunks. An orange streak followed behind their heels, and Violet quickly bent and scooped Crookshanks into her arms. "Ah, right," said Mr. Weasley. "Better get cracking then." He pushed up the sleeves of his robes and took out his wand. Violet saw the Dursleys draw back against the wall as one. "Incendio," said Mr. Weasley, pointing at the hole in the wall behind him. Flames rose at once in the fireplace, crackling merrily as though they had been burning for hours. Mr. Weasley took a small drawstring pouch from his pocket, untied it, took a pinch of the powder inside, and threw it into the flame, which turned emerald green and roared higher than ever. "Off you go then, Fred," said Mr. Weasley. "Coming," said Fred. Oh no, hang on. A bag of sweets had spilled out of Fred's contents, and the contents were now rolling in every direction, big, fat toffees in brightly colored wrappers. Fred scrambled around, cramming them back into his pocket. Violet narrowed her eyes at the one he missed, sitting very obviously beneath the curtains, then gave the Dursleys a cheery wave, dragged Violet's trunk forward with him, and walked right into the fire, saying the burrow. Aunt Petunia gave a little shuddering gasp. There was a whooshing sound, and Fred vanished. "Right then, George," said Mr. Weasley, "you and the other trunk." Harry helped George carry his trunk forward into the flames and turn it onto its end so that he could hold onto it better. Then with a second whoosh, George had cried the burrow and vanished too. "Ron, you next," said Mr. Weasley. "See you," said Ron brightly to the Dursleys. He grinned broadly at Harry, then stepped into the fire, shouted the burrow, and disappeared. Now only Harry, Violet, and Mr. Weasley remained. "Well, bye then," the twins said to the Dursleys. They didn't say anything at all. Violet looked to Harry, nodding for him to go first, and he moved toward the fire, but just as they reached the edge of the hearth, Mr. Weasley put out a hand and held him back. He was looking quite firmly at Aunt Petunia. "Violet and Harry said goodbye to you," he said. "Didn't you hear them?" "It doesn't matter," Harry muttered to Mr. Weasley. "Honestly, I don't care." Mr. Weasley did not remove his hand from Harry's shoulder. "You aren't going to see your niece and nephew until next summer," he said evenly to Aunt Petunia. "Surely you're going to say goodbye." Aunt Petunia's face was a pale, blotchy mask of fear and indignation. The idea of being taught consideration by a man who had just blasted away half her living room seemed to be causing her intense suffering. But Mr. Weasley's wand was still in his hand, and Aunt Petunia's nervous eyes darted to it once before she said, very resentfully, "Goodbye, then." "See you," said Harry, putting one foot into the green flames and shouting, very clearly, the burrow. Just like the Weasley boys before him, his disappeared with a whoosh. Violet, now alone, turned to say goodbye to her aunt as well. Her breath caught, however, when she saw Dudley stoop quickly and snatch up the brightly colored toffee that Fred had left behind. "Dudley," Violet said sharply. Dudley let out a squeak of alarm and clapped his hands back over his bottom, dropping the sweet in the process. Violet rushed to grab it and held it tightly in her fist. She smiled toothily at Dudley. "Good luck with your diet," striding past, and bewildered-looking Mr. Weasley. Violet called back a cheery, "Bye, Aunt Petunia," over her shoulder, before stepping into the fire and shouting, "The burrow." All at once Violet began to spin very fast, and the Dursleys' living room was whipped out of sight in a rush of emerald green flames. Violet spun faster and faster, holding poor Crookshanks tight to her chest, blurred fireplaces flashing past her until she started to feel sick and closed her eyes. Then, when at last she felt herself slowing down, she threw out her hands and came to a halt in time to prevent herself from falling face forward out of the Weasleys' kitchen fire. "Did he eat it?" said Fred excitedly, holding out a hand to catch Violet as she stumbled out into the kitchen. Crookshanks leapt from her arms at once and dashed out of sight into the Weasley household. "No, I stopped him," Violet said sternly. She held out her hand and passed the sweet back to Fred. "What is it?" "Oh, shame. They're Tung-Tung Taffies," he explained. "George and I invented them, and we've been looking for someone to test them on all summer." The tiny kitchen exploded with laughter. Violet looked around and saw that Ron, George, and Harry were sitting at the scrubbed wooden table with two red-haired people Violet had never seen before, though she knew immediately who they must be. Bill and Charlie Weasley, the two eldest Weasley brothers. "How are you doing, Violet?" said the nearer of the two, grinning at her and holding out a large hand, which Violet shook, feeling calluses and blisters under her fingers. This had to be Charlie, who worked with dragons in Romania. Charlie was built like Fred and George, shorter and stockier than Percy and Ron, who were both long and lanky. He had a broad, good-natured face, which was weather-beaten and so freckly that he looked almost tanned. His arms were muscular, and one of them had a large, shiny burn on it. Violet, inexplicably, found herself blushing. Bill got to his feet, smiling, and also shook Violet's hand. Bill came as something of a surprise. Violet knew that he worked for the wizard bank, Gringotts, and that Bill had been head boy at Hogwarts. Violet had always imagined Bill to be an older version of Percy, fussy about rule-breaking and fond of bossing everyone around. However, Bill was, there was no other word for it, cool. He was tall, with long hair that he had tied back in a ponytail. He was wearing an earring with what looked like a fang dangling from it. Bill's clothes would not have looked out of place at a rock concert, except that Violet recognized his boots to be made, not of leather, but of dragon hide. Violet shook Bill's hand as well and hated herself for blushing even harder. Before she could say anything to embarrass herself, there was a faint popping noise, and Mr. Weasley appeared out of thin air at George's shoulder. He was looking very flustered and still had specks of brick and drywall down the front of his robes. "Well," he said, looking around at them all, "I suppose that could have gone smoother." "Sorry about that. You too, if I'd known about the fireplace. We should have said," Violet said quickly, pleased to have an excuse to look at anything besides the two oldest Weasley boys. "Harry and I weren't sure how you planned to pick us up. We should have thought. Mr. Weasley shook his head good-naturedly. "No harm done, Violet. I've put your aunt's living room back into place, and even managed to get a look at the eclectic fireplace," he said brightly. "Marvelous things, plugs, aren't they? They just go right into the sprocket, don't they? And there they are," said a voice behind them. Mrs. Weasley had just quite entered the kitchen. She was a short, plump woman with a very kind face, and Violet barely had time to smile at the sight of her before being bundled into a tight, welcoming hug. "Oh, we're so glad to see you, dears," Mrs. Weasley was saying, releasing Violet to hug Harry as well. Violet staggered back from the embrace, now flushing harder than ever though for very different reasons, and nearly bumped into the two girls that appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Mrs. Weasley. One, with very bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth, was Harry and Ron's friend, Hermione Granger. The other, who was small and red-haired, was Ron's younger sister, Ginny. Both of them smiled at Violet, who smiled back, feeling slightly dazzled when Ginny's face went scarlet as well, though that was very likely from Harry's smile rather than hers. Ginny had been very taken with Harry ever since his first visit to the burrow. "What's that?" said Mrs. Weasley's voice, suddenly sharp. Violet looked around and found her pointing at the brightly wrapped toffee, which Fred must have set down on the kitchen table by mistake, as both he and George were now staring at it with wide eyes. "It's nothing, Mum," said George quickly. "Just a leftover sweet. We're not spoiling our dinner, promise." "I don't recognize that label," Mrs. Weasley, swiping the toffee before George could grab it. "I swear if this has got anything to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, why don't you show Harry and Violet where they're sleeping, Ron?" said Hermione from the doorway. "They know where they're sleeping," said Ron. "They stayed here last year. We can all go," said Hermione pointedly. "Oh," said Ron, cottoning on. "Right. Yeah, we'll come too," said Fred. "Now wait just a minute, Marley," said Mr. Weasley abruptly. "I really must tell you all about the fantastic things those muggles had set up around their house, most all of it powered by electricity, too." He shot a pointed look at Fred and George, who scrambled to their feet at once, while their father launched into a loud and detailed description of Aunt Petunia's living room. Harry, Violet, Hermione, and all the Weasley children, save for Bill and Charlie, vacated the kitchen quickly as they could, and set off along the narrow hallway and up the rickety staircase that zigzagged through the house to the upper stories. "What are Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes?" Violet asked as they climbed. "So glad you should ask," cried Fred from behind her. "Just a little something we've been cooking up in our spare time," said George, all the way at the back of the line. "Joke stuff, you know, fake wands, trick sweets, loads of stuff, all of it brilliant, only it was all a bit dangerous," said Ron from the front, "and Mum found out." Fred and George both heaved loud, dramatic sighs. "And Mum found out," George repeated sorrowfully. "We've been planning to sell our wares at Hogwarts this year," explained Fred, looking wistful. "Had the order forms all printed up and everything ready to go until Mum came snooping, cleaning, she calls it, and put it all to the torch. Says we're not to make any more, so long as we're under her roof, which means we've got to wait till we're at school to start everything up again, which is a huge chunk of prep time wasted. Don't let her hear you saying that," Ginny warned, grinning at them over her shoulder. "She's still furious with you anyway." She looked at Violet and said in a whisper too loud to actually be private, "They didn't get as many OWLS as she expected." "Pa!" exclaimed George. "OWLS," said Fred dismissively. "Who needs them?" "Yowdo," Ginny said. "If you're going to work at the Ministry of Magic like Dad, which we're not," said Fred and George together at once. "So what will you do?" Violet asked, peering back at them. Both Weasley twins smiled broadly at her. "We're going to open a joke shop," said Fred. Just then a door on the second landing opened, and a face poked out wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a very annoyed expression. "Hi, Percy," said Harry. "Oh, hello, Harry Violet," said Percy. "I was wondering who was making all the noise." "I'm trying to work in here. You know I've got a report to finish for the office, and it's rather difficult to concentrate when people keep thundering up and down the stairs." "We're not thundering," said Ron irritably. "We're walking." "Sorry if we've disturbed the top-secret workings of the Ministry of Magic." "What are you working on?" said Harry. "A report for the Department of International Magical Cooperation," said Percy smugly. "We're trying to standardize cauldron thickness. Some of these foreign imports are just a shade too thin. Leakages have been increasing at a rate of almost 3% a year." "That's a lot," Violet said, stunned. Percy nodded seriously at her. "It is indeed, Violet. And unless some sort of international law is imposed, we might well find the market flooded with flimsy, shallow-bottomed products that seriously endanger." Yeah, all right," said Ron, and he started off again. Percy went slightly pink and slammed his bedroom door shut. Violet, who had actually been rather interested in what he'd had to say, glared sourly at Ron's backside as she continued to follow him up. The room at the top of the house where Ron slept looked much as it had the last time that Harry and Violet had come to stay. The same posters of Ron's favorite Quidditch team, the Chudley Cannons, were whirling and waving on the walls and the sloping ceiling, and the fish tank on the windowsill, which has previously held frog spawn, now contained one extremely large frog. Ran's old rat, Scabbers, was here no more, but instead there was the tiny grey owl that had delivered Ran's letter to Harry in Privet Drive. It was hopping up and down in a small cage and twittering madly. "Shoot up, pig," said Ran, edging his way between two of the four beds that had been squeezed into the room. "Fred and George are in here with us, because Bill and Charlie are in their room," he said. "Percy gets to keep his room to himself because he's got toe-work," said George distastefully, sitting heavily on one of the beds. He patted the space next to him, looking for Violet to sit down as well, and she did. Fred flopped down on the other bed and began pulling fistfuls of toffees out of his pockets and stuffing them into his pillowcase. Why are you calling that owl pig?" Harry asked Ron. "Because he's being stupid," said Ginny. "Its proper name is Pigwidgeon." "Yeah, that's not a stupid name at all," said Ron sarcastically. "Ginny named him," he explained to Harry. "She reckons it's sweet, and I tried to change it, but it was too late. He won't answer to anything else, so now he's Pig. I've got to keep him up here because he annoys Errol and Hermes. He annoys me too, come to that." Pigwidgeon zoomed happily around his cage, hooting shrilly. Violet knew Ron too well to take him seriously. He had moaned continually about his old rat, Scabbers, but had been most upset when Crookshanks appeared to have eaten him. "Percy's enjoying work then," said Violet, leaning back and watching the Chudley cannons zooming in and out of the posters on the ceiling. "Enjoying it," said Ron darkly. "I don't reckon he'd have come if Dad didn't make him. He's obsessed. Just don't get him onto the subject of his boss, according to Mr. Crouch. As I was saying to Mr. Crouch, Mr. Crouch is of the opinion, Mr. Crouch was telling me. They'll be announcing their engagement any day now. Have you two had a good summer?" said Hermione. "Did you get our food parcels and everything?" "Yeah, thanks a lot," said Harry. "They saved our lives, those cakes." "And have you heard from Sirius?" said Ron eagerly. "Mum's been reading the papers, keeping up with the trial. Dad says the whole ministry is in an uproar over it. Loads of people have come forward saying that thought he was innocent all along," said Fred, "but nobody wanted to listen to them while he was in prison." "That's another thing not to mention around Percy," said George in a low voice. "Why not?" Violet asked. "'Cause of his boss Crouch is the one who sent Black to Azkaban in the first place, and Perce reckons he's infallible, won't hear a word against him. He and Dad had a big row about it last week, didn't speak to each other for days after," finished Fred grimly. Violet digested this information with the feeling of a stone settling her in belly. She decided that she didn't care what Percy had to say about cauldron thickness after all. Perhaps he ought to be checking the thickness of his own head instead. Something of her feelings must have shown on her face, because Ginny cleared her throat and said, "Dad's probably got Mum to cool off by now. Should we go and help with dinner?" "Yeah, all right," said Ron. The seven of them left Ron's room and went back downstairs. Ron made sure to stomp his feet extra loudly as they passed Percy's bedroom door, and Fred and George broke off and headed out the front door, going the long way round the house rather than face their mother. The rest of them entered the kitchen to find Mrs. Weasley alone in the kitchen, looking extremely bad-tempered. "We're eating out in the garden," she said when they all came in. "There's just not enough room for 12 people in here. Could you take the plates outside, girls? Bill and Charlie are setting up the tables." Violet and Hermione followed Ginny's lead in gathering up the plates and bowls that had been set out on the table and carried them carefully out the back door into the Weasleys' yard. They had only gone a few paces when Crookshanks came pelting out of the garden, bottle-brush tail held high in the air, chasing what looked like a muddy potato on legs. Violet recognized it instantly as a gnome. Barely 10 inches high, its horny little feet pattered very fast as it sprinted across the yard and dived headlong into one of the Wellington boots that lay scattered around the door. Violet could hear the gnome giggling madly as Crookshanks inserted a paw into the boot, trying to reach it. Meanwhile, a very loud crashing was coming from the other side of the house. The source of the commotion was revealed as they entered the garden. and saw that Bill and Charlie both had their wands out and were making two battered old tables fly high above the lawn, smashing into each other, each attempting to knock the others out of the air. Ginny burst into laughter as soon as she saw them. Fred and George were cheering in favor of the chaos over rooting for any particular brother. Bill's table caught Charlie's with a huge bang and knocked one of its legs off. There was a clatter from overhead, and they all looked up to see Percy's head poking out of a window on the second floor. "Will you keep it down?" he bellowed. "Sorry, Perce," said Bill, grinning. "Hooray, the cauldron bottom's coming on." "Very badly," said Percy peevishly, and he slammed the window shut. Bill and Charlie directed the tables safely onto the grass, end to end, and then, with a flick of his wand, Bill reattached the table leg and conjured tablecloths from nowhere, just in time for Harry and Ron to come hurrying out with fistfuls of silverware. By 7 o'clock, the two tables were groaning under dishes and dishes of Mrs. Weasley's excellent cooking, and the 9 Weasleys, Violet, Harry, and Hermione, were settling themselves down to eat beneath a clear, deep blue sky. To someone who had been living on meals of increasingly stale cake all summer, this was paradise, and at first Violet listened rather than talked as she helped herself to a chicken and ham pie, boiled potatoes, and salad. At the far end of the table, Percy was telling his father all about his report on cauldron bottoms. Violet pricked up her ears at the mention of Percy's boss. "I've told Mr. Crouch that I'll have it ready by Tuesday," Percy was saying pompously. "That's a bit sooner than he expected it, but I like to keep on top of things. I think he'll be grateful I've done it on good time. I mean, it's extremely busy in our department just now, what with all the arrangements for the World Cup. We're just not getting the support we need from the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Ludo Bagman, I like Ludo," said Mr. Weasley mildly. "He was the one who got us such good tickets for the cup. I did him a bit of a favor. His brother, Otto, got into a spot of trouble, a lawnmower with unnatural powers. I smoothed the whole thing over." "Oh, Bagman's slickable enough, of course," said Percy dismissively, "but how he ever got to be head of department, when I compare him to Mr. Crouch. I can't see Mr. Crouch losing a member of our department and not trying to find out what's happened to them. You realize Bertha Jorkins has been missing for over a month now, went on holiday to Albania and never came back." "Yes, I was asking Ludo about that," said Mr. Weasley, frowning. "He says Bertha's gotten lost plenty of times before now, though I must say, if it was someone in my department, I'd be worried." "Oh, Bertha's hopeless. All right," said Percy. "I hear she's been shunted from department to department for years, much more trouble than she's worth. But all the same, Bagman ought to be trying to find her. Mr. Crouch has been taking a personal interest. She worked in our department at one time, you know, and I think Mr. Crouch was quite fond of her, but Bagman just keeps laughing and saying she probably misread the map and ended up in Australia instead of Albania." However, Percy heaved an impressive sigh and took a deep swig of elderflower wine. "We've got quite enough on our plates at the Department of International Magical Cooperation, without trying to find members of other departments too. As you know, we've got another big event to organize after the World Cup." Percy cleared his throat significantly and looked down toward the end of the table where Harry, Ron, and Hermione were sitting. "Yown, the one I'm talking about, Father." He raised his voice slightly. "The top secret one." Ron rolled his eyes and muttered something to Harry and Hermione. Violet, seated between Fred and George at their insistence, was too distracted to hear. Right across the table, Mrs. Weasley was arguing with Bill about his earring, which seemed to be a recent acquisition. "With a horrible great fang on it. Really, Bill, what do they say at the bank?" "Mum, no one at the bank gives a damn how I dress as long as I bring home plenty of treasure," said Bill patiently. "And your hair's getting silly, dear," said Mrs. Weasley, fingering her wand lovingly. "I wish you'd let me give it a trim." "I like it," said Ginny, who was sitting beside Bill. "You're so old-fashioned, Mum. Anyways, it's nowhere near as long as Professor Dumbledore's." Charlie sat on Mrs. Weasley's other side, and was leaning across the table to talk spiritedly with Fred and George about the World Cup. "It's got to be Ireland," said Charlie thickly, through a mouthful of potato. "They flattened Peru in the semi-finals. Bulgaria has got Victor Crumb, though," said Fred. "Crumb's one decent player, Ireland's got 7, said Charlie shortly. "I wish England had got through. That was embarrassing, that was." "What happened?" said Harry eagerly, leaning forward in his seat. "Went down to Transylvania, 390 to 10, said Charlie gloomily. "Shocking performance. And Wales lost to Uganda, and Scotland was slaughtered by Luxembourg." Violet couldn't help but roll her eyes as the discussion deepened. Harry was obsessed with Quidditch. He had been on the Gryffindor house team ever since his first year, and owned one of the best racing brooms in the world, a Firebolt. She couldn't deny that her brother had a fair knack for flying and was a brilliant seeker, but the sport had a habit of consuming his attention. Violet looked longingly across the table at where Ginny and Bill sat and wished she'd had sense to rethink her seating arrangement. Mr. Weasley conjured up candles to light the darkening garden before they had their homemade strawberry ice cream, and by the time they had finished, moths were fluttering low over the table, and the warm air was perfumed with the smells of grass and honeysuckle. Violet was feeling extremely well fed and at peace with the world as she watched several gnomes sprinting through the rose bushes, laughing madly and closely pursued by Crookshanks. He was only playing. Violet was sure if he actually meant to hunt to gnomes, the little creatures would be shrieking in terror instead of cackling. "Look at the time," Mrs. Weasley said suddenly, checking her wristwatch. "You really should be in bed. The whole lot of you'll be up at the crack of dawn to get to the cup. Harry, Violet, if you leave your school list out, I'll get your things for you tomorrow in Diagon Alley. I'm getting everyone else's." There might not be time after the World Cup. The match went on for 5 days last time. "Wow, hope it does this time," said Harry enthusiastically. "Well, I certainly don't," said Percy sanctimoniously. "I shudder to think what the state of my in-try would be if I was away from work for 5 days." "Yeah, someone might slip dragon dung in it again, Perce?" said Fred. "That was a sample of fertilizer from Norway," said Percy, going very red in the face. "It was nothing personal." "It was," George whispered to Violet as they got up from the table. "We sent it." Violet, Ginny, and Charlie stayed behind to help clean up the table even as Mrs. Weasley protested. It didn't feel right to leave all the work to her, after she'd cooked such a lovely meal for them all. The 3 of them carried dirty plates into the house and tipped them into the sink, and Violet was just about to follow Ginny up to bed when Mrs. Weasley pulled her aside. "Here, dear, come with me a moment," said Mrs. Weasley gently, and Violet nervously sank into a chair at the kitchen table. She wasn't afraid of Mrs. Weasley in the least, but being asked to speak to an adult alone had always made her feel rather queasy. It came as complete surprise when Mrs. Weasley reached out and touched her hair. "I suppose the Muggles did this?" she asked, and Violet flushed with embarrassment as she nodded. "Aunt Petunia said it was getting too long," Violet mumbled. Mrs. Weasley tutted softly. "And I suppose she chopped it herself, did she?" Again, Violet nodded. As unhappy as she was with her own haircut, she had hoped it wasn't really as bad as she feared, and that other people wouldn't be able to notice. Those hopes were currently being dashed against the rocks as Mrs. Weasley moved to stand behind her, fingers carding deftly through the many knots and tangles in Violet's hair. "Really, now," Mrs. Weasley grumbled. "You could do with a bit of sleekies, dear." "I'll have to pick some up for you tomorrow." Violet didn't know what sleekies was, but she hoped it wasn't very expensive. The thought of Mrs. Weasley paying for her school supplies already had Violet's stomach roiling with guilt. The Weasleys made up in kindness for what they lacked in coin, and they were a very kind family. She sat still and closed her eyes as Mrs. Weasley worked the worst of the tangles from her hair, tutting occasionally but never pulling hard enough to hurt, as Aunt Petunia often did. Violet felt firm tugging on first one side of her head and then the other, and reached up eagerly to feel the result when Mrs. Weasley was done. There, said Mrs. Weasley proudly, coming around to look at Violet from the front. How's that feel, dear? Too tight? It feels fine, Violet said quickly, gently feeling the two short French braids that now ran down the back of her head. I've never done it with two before. Thanks, Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley only smiled wider and swept Violet into a tight, warm hug. When she pulled away, she lightly cupped Violet's face in her hands for a moment. It suits you, Violet, she said sincerely. Violet's face must have flushed hot enough to burn because Mrs. Weasley let her hands fall and hurried her off to bed. Chapter 3. Bagman and Crouch. Violet felt as though she had barely lain down to sleep in Ginny's room when she was being shaken awake by Mrs. Weasley. Time to go, Violet, dear, she whispered, moving away to wake up Hermione. Violet sat up in bed and stretched, her mouth opening in a wide yawn. It was still dark outside. Hermione muttered indistinctly as Mrs. Weasley roused her. Across the room from Violet's mattress, she saw a small, disheveled shape emerging from a tangle of blankets. "It's time already," said Ginny groggily. They dressed in silence, too sleepy to talk. Then, yawning and stretching, the three of them headed downstairs into the kitchen. Mr. Weasley and all the boys were already up and dressed as well, sitting around the table and chewing groggily on bits of toast and bacon. Violet fell heavily into the empty chair beside Harry and snagged a sausage from his plate. "Why do we have to be up so early?" Ginny said, rubbing her eyes. "We've got a bit of a walk," said Mr. Weasley. "Walk," said Harry. "What, are we walking to the World Cup?" "No, no, that's miles away," said Mr. Weasley, smiling. "We only need to walk a short way. It's just that it's very difficult for a large number of wizards to congregate without attracting Muggle attention. We have to be very careful about how we travel at the best of times, and on a huge occasion like the Quidditch World Cup." "George," said Mrs. Weasley sharply, and they all jumped. "What?" said George, in an innocent tone that deceived nobody. "What is that in your pocket?" "Nothing. Don't you lie to me." Mrs. Weasley pointed her wand at George's pocket and said, "Accio." Several small, brightly colored objects zoomed out of George's pocket. He made a grab for them but missed, and they sped right into Mrs. Weasley's outstretched hand. "We told you to destroy them," said Mrs. Weasley furiously, holding up what were unmistakable more Tung-Tung Toffees. "We told you to get rid of the lot. Empty your pockets, go on, both of you." It was an unpleasant scene. The twins had evidently been trying to smuggle as many toffees out of the house as possible, and it was only by using her summoning charm that Mrs. Weasley managed to find them all. "Accio! Accio! Accio!" she shouted, and toffees zoomed from all sorts of unlikely places, including the lining of George's jacket and the turn-ups of Fred's jeans. "We spent 6 months developing those," Fred shouted at his mother as she threw the toffees away. "Oh, a fine way to spend 6 months," she shrieked. "Now wonder you didn't get more OWLS." All in all, the atmosphere was not very friendly as they took their departure. Mrs. Weasley was still glowering as she kissed Mr. Weasley on the cheek. Violet had to do a double take when he stood from the table. Rather than robes, he appeared to be wearing a golf sweater and a pair of very old, overlarge blue jeans held up by a leather belt, though not nearly as much as the twins, who had each hoisted their rucksacks onto their backs and walked out without a word to her. "Well, have a lovely time," said Mrs. Weasley, "and behave yourselves," she called after the twins' retreating backs, but they did not look or answer. "I'll send Bill, Charlie, and Percy along around midday," Mrs. Weasley said to Mr. Weasley as he, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny set off across the dark yard. Violet hurried ahead and inserted herself between Fred and George as they stomped across the yard, looping each arm companionably around one of theirs. They didn't slow their stride, but nor did they shrug her off. It was chilly, and the moon was still out a waning crescent. Violet had been paying special attention to the cycles of the moon all summer, thinking of her godfather all the while. Only a dull, greenish tinge along the horizon to their right showed that daybreak was drawing closer. Violet, still clinging determinedly to Fred and George, heard footsteps speeding up behind her, followed by Harry's voice. "So how does everyone get there without all the muggles noticing?" he asked. "It's been a massive organizational problem," sighed Mr. Weasley behind her. "The trouble is, about 100,000 wizards turn up at the World Cup, and of course, we just haven't got a magical site big enough to accommodate them all. There are places muggles can't penetrate, but imagine trying to pack 100,000 wizards into Diagon Alley or Platform 9 3/4. So we had to find a nice deserted moor and set up as many anti-muggle precautions as possible. The whole ministry's been working on it for months. First, of course, we have to stagger the arrivals. People with cheaper tickets have to arrive 2 weeks beforehand. A limited number use Muggle transport, but we can't have too many clogging up their buses and trains. Remember, wizards are coming from all over the world. Some apparate, of course, but we have to set up safe points for them to appear, well away from the Muggles. I believe there's a handy wood they're using for the apparition point. For those who don't want to apparate, or can't, we use portkeys. They're objects that are used to transport wizards from one spot to another at a prearranged time. You can do large groups at a time if you need to. There have been 200 portkeys placed at strategic points around Britain, and the nearest one to us is up at the top of Stoatshead Hill, so that's where we're headed. Far ahead in the distance, Violet could see a large black mass rising beyond the village of Ottery St. Catchpole. "What sort of objects are portkeys?" asked Harry curiously. "Well, they can be anything," said Mr. Weasley. "Unobtrusive things, obviously, so muggles don't go picking them up and playing with them. Stuff they'll just think is litter." Violet debated telling Mr. Weasley about the sorts of muggles that went around specifically picking up litter, but decided it wasn't worth causing a logistical panic so early in the morning. She kept her comments to herself. They trudged down the dark, dank lane toward the village, the silence broken only by their footsteps. The sky lightened very slowly as they made their way through the village, its inky blackness diluting to deepest blue. Violet's feet were freezing, and she was shivering, despite the warmth of the Weasleys on either side of her. They didn't have breath to spare for talking, as they began to climb Stoatshead Hill, stumbling occasionally in hidden rabbit holes, slipping on thick black tufts of grass. Each breath Violet took was sharp in her chest, and her legs were starting to seize up when, at last, her feet found level ground. "Hugh," panted Mr. Weasley, taking off his glasses and wiping them on his sweater. "Well, we've made good time. We've got 10 minutes. Hermione came over the crest of the hill last, clutching a stitch in her side. "Now we just need to find the portkey," said Mr. Weasley, replacing his glasses and squinting around at the ground. "It won't be big. Come on." They spread out, searching. They had only been at it for a couple of minutes, however, when a shout rent the still air. "Over here, Arthur. Over here, son, we've got it." Two tall figures were silhouetted against the starry sky on the other side of the hilltop. "Amos," said Mr. Weasley, smiling as he strode over to the man who had shouted. The rest of them followed. Mr. Weasley was shaking hands with a ruddy-faced wizard with a scrubby brown beard, who was holding a mouldy-looking old boot in his other hand. "This is Amos Diggory, everyone," said Mr. Weasley. "He works for the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. And I think you know his son, Cedric." Cedric Diggory was an extremely handsome boy of around 17. He was captain and seeker of the Hufflepuff House Quidditch team at Hogwarts, which Violet knew not from Harry, who had played against him, but from her best friend Tracy Davis. Tracy fancied Cedric, and it wasn't hard to see why. "Hi," said Cedric, looking around at them all. Everybody said hi back, except Fred and George, who merely nodded. Not only were they still steamed about the fight with their mother, but they had never quite forgiven Cedric for beating their team, Gryffindor, in the first Quidditch match of the previous year. "Long walk, Arthur?" Cedric's father asked. "Not too bad," said Mr. Weasley. "We live just on the other side of the village there. You had to get up at 2, didn't we?" said. "I tell you, I'll be glad when he's got his apparition test. Still, not complaining. Quidditch World Cup, wouldn't miss it for a sack full of galleons, and the tickets cost about that. Mind you, looks like I got off easy." Amos Diggory peered good-naturedly around at the three Weasley boys, Harry and Violet, Hermione and Ginny. "All these yours, Arthur?" "Oh no, only the redheads," said Mr. Weasley, pointing out his children. "This is Hermione, friend of Ron's the other twins, Harry and Violet, more friends, Merlin's beard," said Amos Diggory, his eyes widening. "Harry and Violet." "Harry and Violet, Potter." Yeah," said Harry of the two of them. Harry was far more used to people looking curiously at him when they met them. It was Harry they looked most closely at, their eyes moving at once to the lightning scar on his forehead before flicking briefly to Violet, almost an afterthought, just as Mr. Diggory's did now. It was always uncomfortable. "Ced's talked about you, of course," said Amos Diggory, speaking directly to Harry. "Told us all about playing against you last year. I said to him, I said, that'll be something to tell your grandchildren, that will." "You beat Harry Potter." Harry's mouth fell open slightly, the way it did when he didn't know how to respond to something. Fred and George were both scowling again. Cedric looked slightly embarrassed. "Harry fell off his broom, Dad," he muttered. "I told you. It was an accident." "Yes, Beauty Owl didn't fall off, did you?" roared Amos genially, slapping his son on the back. "Always modest," I said, "always the gentleman. But the best man one, I'm sure Harry'd say the same, wouldn't you, eh? One falls off his broom, one stays on. You don't need to be a genius to tell which one's the better flyer." "Must be nearly time," said Mr. Weasley quickly, pulling out his watch again. "Do you know whether we're waiting for any more, Amos?" "No, the Lovegoods have been there for a week already, and the Fawcett's couldn't get tickets," said Mr. Diggory. "There aren't many more of us in this area, are there?" "Not that I know of," said Mr. Weasley. "Yes, it's a minute off. We'd better get ready." He looked around at Harry, Violet, and Hermione. "You just need to touch the portkey, that's all. A finger will do, with difficulty, owing to their bulky backpacks." The 10 of them crowded around the old boot held out by Amos Diggory. They all stood there in a tight circle as a chill breeze swept over the hilltop. Nobody spoke. It suddenly occurred to Violet how this would look if a muggle were to walk up here now. 10 people, 2 of them grown men, clutching this manky old boot in the semi-darkness, waiting. 3, muttered Mr. Weasley, one eye still on his watch. 2, 1. It happened immediately. Violet felt as though a hook just behind her navel had been jerked irresistibly forward. Her feet left the ground. She could feel George and Ginny on either side of her, their shoulders banging into hers. They were all speeding forward in a howl of wind and swirling color. Her forefinger was stuck to the boot, as though it was pulling her magnetically onward, and then her feet slammed into the ground. Ginny staggered into her, and they both fell over. The portkey hit the ground near her head with a heavy thud. Violet looked up. Mr. Weasley, Mr. Diggory, and Cedric were still standing, though looking very windswept. Everybody else was on the ground. 7 past 5 from Stoatshead Hill, said a voice. Violet and Ginny disentangled and helped one another to their feet. They had arrived on what appeared to be a deserted stretch of misty moor. In front of them was a pair of tired and grumpy-looking wizards, one of whom was holding a large gold watch, the other a thick roll of parchment and a quill. Both were dressed as muggles, though very inexpertly. The man with the watch wore a tweed suit with thigh-length galoshes, his colleague a kilt and a poncho. "Morning, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, picking up the boot and handing it to the kilted wizard, who threw it into a large box of used portkeys beside him. Violet could see an old newspaper, an empty drinks can, and a punctured football. "Hello there, Arthur," said Basil wearily. "Not on duty, eh? It's all right for some. We've been here all night. You'd better get out of the way. We've got a big party coming in from the Black Forest at 5:15. Hang on, I'll find your campsite. Weasley. He consulted his parchment list. "About a quarter of a mile's walk over there, first field you come to. Site manager's called Mr. Roberts. Diggory. Second field. Ask for Mr. Payne." "Thanks, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, and he beckoned everyone to follow him. They set off across the deserted moor, unable to make out much through the mist. After about 20 minutes, a small stone cottage next to a gate swam into view. Beyond it, Violet could just make out the ghostly shapes of hundreds and hundreds of tents rising up the gentle slope of a large field toward a dark wood on the horizon. They said goodbye to the diggories and approached the cottage door. A man was standing in the doorway, looking out at the tents. Violet knew at a glance that this was the only real muggle for several acres. When he heard their footsteps, he turned his head to look at them. "Morning," said Mr. Weasley brightly. "Morning," said the muggle. "Would you be Mr. Roberts?" I would," said Mr. Roberts. "And hooray you, Weasley 2 tents booked a couple of days ago." "Aye," said Mr. Roberts, consulting a list tacked to the door. "You've got a space up by the wood there, just the one night." "That's it," said Mr. Weasley. "You'll be paying now, then," said Mr. Roberts. "Ah, right, certainly," said Mr. Weasley. He retreated a short distance from the cottage and beckoned Harry toward him. "Help me, Harry," he muttered, pulling a roll of muggle money from his pocket and starting to peel the notes apart. "This one's a 10. Ah, yes, I see the little number on it now. So this is a 5. A 20, Harry corrected him in an undertone. Violet smiled uncomfortably at Mr. Roberts, who was plainly trying to catch every word. "Ah, yes, so it is. I don't know, these little bits of paper." "You foreign," said Mr. Roberts, as Mr. Weasley returned with the correct notes. "Foreign," repeated Mr. Weasley, puzzled. "You're not the first one who's had trouble with money," said Mr. Roberts, scrutinizing Mr. Weasley closely. "I had 2 try and pay me with great gold coins 10 minutes ago." "Did you really?" said Mr. Weasley nervously. Mr. Roberts rummaged around in a tin for some change. "Never been this crowded," he said suddenly, looking out over the misty field again. "Hundreds of pre-bookings. People usually just turn up." "Is that right?" said Mr. Weasley, his hand held out for his change, but Mr. Roberts didn't give it to him. "Aye," he said thoughtfully. "People from all over, loads of foreigners, and not just foreigners, weirdos, you know. There's a bloke walking round in a kilt and a poncho." "Shouldn't he?" said Mr. Weasley anxiously. "It's like some sort of, I dunno, like some sort of rally," said Mr. Roberts. "They all seem to know each other. Like a big party." At that moment, a wizard in +4s appeared out of thin air next to Mr. Roberts' front door. "Obliviate," he said sharply, pointing his wand at Mr. Roberts. Instantly, Mr. Roberts' eyes slid out of focus, his brows unknitted, and a look of dreamy unconcern fell over his face. Violet stared in disbelief. "A map of the campsite for you," said Mr. Roberts placidly to Mr. Weasley. "And your change." "Thanks very much," said Mr. Weasley. The wizard in +4s accompanied them toward the gate to the campsite. He looked exhausted. His chin was blue with stubble, and there were deep purple shadows under his eyes. Once out of earshot of Mr. Roberts, he muttered to Mr. Weasley, "Been having a lot of trouble with him. Needs a memory charm 10 times a day to keep him happy, and Ludo Bagman's not helping." Trotting around talking about bludgers and quaffles at the top of his voice, not a worry about anti-muggle security. "Blimey, I'll be glad when this is over. See you later, Arthur," he disapparated. "I thought Mr. Bagman was head of magical games and sports," said Ginny, looking surprised. "He should know better than to talk about bludgers near muggles, shouldn't he?" "He should," said Mr. Weasley, smiling and leading them through the gates into the campsite, "but Ludo's always been a bit, well, lax about security." You couldn't wish for a more enthusiastic head of the sports department, though. He played Quidditch for England himself, you know, and he was the best beater the Wimborne Wasps ever had. They trudged up the misty field between long rows of tents. Most looked almost ordinary. Their owners had clearly tried to make them as muggle-like as possible, but had slipped up by adding chimneys, or bell pulls, or weather vanes. However, here and there was a tent to obviously magical that Violet could hardly be surprised that Mr. Roberts was getting suspicious. Halfway up the field stood an extravagant confection of striped silk like a miniature palace, with several live peacocks tethered at the entrance. A little farther on they passed a tent that had 3 floors and several turrets, and a short way beyond that was a tent that had a front garden attached, complete with a bird bath, sundial, and fountain. "Always the same," said Mr. Weasley, smiling. "We can't resist showing off when we get together. Ah, here we are, look, this is us." They had reached the very edge of the wood at the top of the field, and here was an empty space, with a small sign hammered into the ground that read Weasley. "Couldn't have a better spot," said Mr. Weasley happily. "The field is just on the other side of the wood there. We're as close as we could be." He hoisted his backpack from his shoulders. "Right," he said excitedly. "No magic allowed, strictly speaking, not when we're out in these numbers of Muggle land. We'll be pulling these tents up by hand. Shouldn't be too difficult. Muggles do it all the time. Here, you two, where do you reckon we should start?" Harry and Violet looked at one another in mild panic. Neither of them had ever been camping in their lives. The Dursleys had never taken them on any kind of holiday, preferring to leave them with Mrs. Figg, an old neighbor. However, with Hermione's help, they worked out where most of the poles and pegs should go, and though Mr. Weasley was more of a hindrance than a help, because he got thoroughly overexcited when it came to using the mallet, they finally managed to erect a pair of shabby two-man tents. All of them stood back to admire their handiwork. Nobody looking at these tents would guess they belonged to wizards, Violet thought. But the trouble was that once Bill, Charlie, and Percy arrived, they would be a party of 11. Hermione seemed to have spotted this problem as well. She gave Violet a quizzical look as Mr. Weasley dropped to his hands and knees and entered the first tent. "We'll be a bit cramped," he called, "but I think we'll all squeeze in. Come and have a look." Harry went first. Violet watched with wide eyes as he neatly disappeared under the tent flap, and though he should have been jostled alongside Mr. Weasley, the tent didn't move or shift at all. Violet followed cautiously. She bent down, ducked under the tent flap, and felt her jaw drop. She had crawled into what looked an old-fashioned 3-room flat, complete with bathroom and kitchen. Oddly enough, it was furnished in exactly the same sort of style as Mrs. Figg's house. There were crocheted covers in the mismatched chairs and a strong smell of cats. "Well, it's not for long," said Mr. Weasley, mopping his bald patch with a handkerchief and peering in at the 4 bunk beds that stood in the bedroom. "I borrowed this from Perkins at the office. Doesn't camp much anymore, poor fellow, he's got lumbago." He picked up the dusty kettle and peered inside it. "We'll need water." "There's a tap marked on this map the Muggle gave us," said Ron, who had followed Violet inside the tent and seemed completely unimpressed by its extraordinary inner proportions. "It's on the other side of the field." "Well, why don't you, Harry, and Hermione get us some water then, Mr. Weasley handed over the kettle and a couple of saucepans, and the rest of us will get some food for a fire." "But we've got an oven," said Ron. "Why can't we just Ron, anti-Muggle security," said Mr. Weasley, his face shining with anticipation. "When real Muggles camp, they cook on fires outdoors. I've seen them at it." After dropping their things off in the girls' tent, which was slightly smaller than the boys'. Though without the smell of cats, Violet and Ginny met up with Fred and George outside and set off in search of firewood. Now, with the sun newly risen and the mist lifting, they could see the city of tents that stretched in every direction. They made their way slowly through the rows, staring eagerly around. It was fascinating to see how many wizards and witches had come from different countries for the World Cup. Their fellow campers were starting to wake up. First to stir were the families with small children. Violet had never seen witches and wizards this young before. A tiny boy no older than 2 was crouched outside a large pyramid-shaped tent, holding a wand and poking happily at a slug in the grass, which was swelling slowly to the size of a salami. As they drew level with him, his mother came hurrying out of the tent. "How many times, Kevin?" "Yow don't touch Daddy's wand, Yek." She had trodden on the giant slug, which burst. Her scolding carried after them on the still air, mingling with the little boy's yells, "You bust slug! You bust slug!" A short way farther on, they saw 2 little witches, barely older than Kevin, who were riding toy broomsticks that rose only high enough for the girl's toes to skim the dewy grass. A ministry wizard had already spotted them. As he hurried past Violet and Ginny, he muttered distractedly, "In broad daylight. Parents having a lie-in, I suppose." Here, and their adult wizards and witches were emerging from their tents and starting to cook breakfast. Some, with furtive looks around them, conjured fires with their wands. Others were striking matches with dubious looks on their faces, as though sure this couldn't work. 3 African wizards sat in serious conversation, all of them wearing long white robes and roasting what looked like a rabbit on a bright purple fire, while a group of middle-aged American witches sat gossiping happily beneath the spangled banner stretched between their tents that read, "The Salem Witches' Institute." Violet caught snatches of conversation in strange languages from the insides of tents as they passed, and though she couldn't understand a word, the tone of every single voice was excited. "This is brilliant," she muttered in wonder, turning back to stare at a patch of tents that were all covered with a thick growth of shamrocks, so that it looked as though small, oddly shaped hillocks had sprouted out of the earth. "I've never seen so many of us in one place." "Makes Diagon Alley look deserted, doesn't it?" said Fred, grinning at her over his shoulder. "Now you see why the ministry's having such a hard time of it," said George, walking backwards to talk to Violet. "Pity we can't all get together like this more often." "Is Quidditch really the only time wizards gather?" Violet asked. George laughed and shook his head. "Course not every so often there'll be an international summit or something more serious where wizards from all over show up and argue about laws and regulations. The cup is just the biggest. And the loudest," Fred added. Violet was completely overwhelmed by all the sights, sounds, and smells. Everywhere she looked, she saw children and families playing and settling down to breakfast. She saw a group of teenagers she'd never seen before, clearly not students at Hogwarts, and realized they must have come from some other wizarding school abroad. Her mind was reeling. She barely noticed when the 4 of them arrived at a large stack of complimentary firewood, and Ginny dumped a stack of logs into her arms. Mr. Weasley was shaking out the blankets when they returned with the firewood. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had not yet returned with the water. "Ah, excellent," said Mr. Weasley at the sight of them. "We'll have breakfast going in no time. Violet, if you would I have these matches, it was great fun trying to teach Mr. Weasley how to strike a match." First, he was far too timid about it, barely scraping the head of the match on the side of the box to no effect. After watching Violet demonstrate how to do it properly, he became too bold and broke 5 matchsticks in a row in his excitement. "They's just gotten a fire going when Harry and his friends came back. You've been ages," said George. "Met a few people," said Ron, setting the water down. "You got that fire started yet, Dad?" "He's been having fun with the matchsticks," said Fred. It was at least another hour before the fire was hot enough to cook anything. Their tent seemed to be pitched right alongside a kind of thoroughfare to the field, and ministry members kept hurrying up and down it, greeting Mr. Weasley cordially as they passed. Mr. Weasley kept up a running commentary, mainly for Violet, Harry, and Hermione's benefit. His own children knew too much about the ministry to be greatly interested. That was Cuthbert Markridge, head of the Goblin Liaison Office. "Here come Gilbert Wimple. He's with the Committee of Experimental Charms. He's had those horns for a while." "Hello, Arnie. Arnold Peacegood. He's an Obliviator member of the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad, you know. And that's Bode and Croaker. They're unspeakables." "They're what?" asked Violet in alarm. "From the Department of Mysteries, top secret. No idea what they get up to." At last, the fire was ready, and they had just started cooking eggs and sausages when Bill, Charlie, and Percy came strolling out of the woods toward them. "Just apparated, Dad," said Percy loudly. "Ah, excellent lunch." They were halfway through their plates of eggs and sausages when Mr. Weasley jumped to his feet, waving and grinning at a man who was striding toward them. "Aha," he said, "the man of the moment." Ludo Bagman, was easily the most noticeable person Violet had seen so far, even including Basil in his kilt and poncho. He was wearing long Quidditch robes in thick horizontal stripes of bright yellow and black. An enormous picture of a wasp was splashed across his chest. He had the look of a powerfully built man gone slightly to seed. The robes were stretched tightly across a large belly he surely had not had in the days when he had played Quidditch for England. His nose was squashed, probably broken by a stray bludger, Violet thought, but his round blue eyes, short blonde hair, and rosy complexion made him look like a very overgrown schoolboy. "Ahoy there!" Bagman called happily. He was walking as though he had springs attached to the balls of his feet and was plainly in a state of wild excitement. "Arthur, old man," he puffed as he reached the campfire. "What a day, eh? What a day! Could we have asked for more perfect weather? A cloudless night coming. And hardly a hiccup in the arrangements. Not much for me to do." Behind him, a group of haggard-looking ministry wizards rushed past, pointing at the distant evidence of some sort of magical fire that was sending violet sparks 20 feet into the air. Percy hurried forward with his hand outstretched. Apparently, his disapproval of the way Ludo Bagman ran his department did not prevent him from wanting to make a good impression. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Weasley, grinning. "This is my son, Percy. He's just started at the ministry, and this is Fred now. George, sorry, that's Fred, Bill, Charlie, Ron, my daughter, Ginny, and Ron's friends, Hermione Granger, and Harry and Violet Potter." Bagman did the smallest of double takes when he heard the name Potter, and his eyes performed the familiar flick upward to the scar on Harry's forehead. "Everyone," Mr. Weasley continued, "this is Ludo Bagman. You know who he is. It's thanks to him we've got such good tickets." Bagman beamed and waved his hand as if to say it had been nothing. "Fancy a flutter on the match, Arthur," he said eagerly, jungling what seemed to be a large amount of gold in the pockets of his yellow and black robes. "I've already got Roddy Pontner betting me Bulgaria will score first." I offered him nice odds, considering Ireland's front three are the strongest I've seen in years, and little Agatha Timms has put up half shares in her eel farm on a week-long match. "Oh, go on then," said Mr. Weasley. "Let's see, a galleon on Ireland to win." "A galleon?" Ludo Bagman looked slightly disappointed, but recovered himself quickly. Very well, very well. Any other takers?" "They're a bit young to be gambling," said Mr. Weasley. "Marley wouldn't like. We'll bet 37 galleons, 15 sickles, 3 nuts," said Fred, as he and George quickly pooled all their money. "That Ireland wins, but Victor Crumb gets the snitch. Oh, and we'll throw in a fake wand. You don't want to go showing, mister." "Bagman rubbish like that," Percy hissed, but Bagman didn't seem to think the wand was rubbish at all. On the contrary, his boyish face shone with excitement as he took it from Fred, and when the wand gave a loud squawk and turned into a rubber chicken, Bagman roared with laughter. "Excellent. I haven't seen one that convincing in years. I'd pay 5 galleons for that." Percy froze in an attitude of stunned disapproval. "Boys," said Mr. Weasley under his breath, "I don't want you betting. That's all you're saving." "Your mother, don't be a spoilsport, Arthur," boomed Ludo Bagman, rattling his pocket excitedly. "They're old enough to know what they want. You reckon Ireland will win, but Crum'll get the snitch. Not a chance, boys, not a chance. I'll give you excellent odds on that one." "We'll add 5 galleons for the funny wand, then, shall we?" Mr. Weasley looked on helplessly as Ludo Bagman whipped out a notebook and quill and began jotting down the twins' names. "Cheers," said George, taking the slip of parchment Bagman handed him and tucking it away carefully. Bagman turned most cheerfully back to Mr. Weasley. "Couldn't do me a brew, I suppose. I'm keeping an eye out for Barty Crouch. My Bulgarian opposite number's making difficulties, and I can't understand a word he's saying. Barty'll be able to sort it out. He speaks about 150 languages." "Mr. Crouch," said Percy, suddenly abandoning his look of poker-still disapproval and positively writhing with excitement. "He speaks over 200, Mermish and Gobbledegook and Troll." "Anyone can speak Troll," said Fred dismissively. "All you have to do is point and grunt." Percy threw Fred an extremely nasty look and stoked the fire vigorously to bring the kettle back to a boil. Any news of Bertha Jorkins yet, Ludo? Mr. Weasley asked, as Bagman settled himself down on the grass beside them all. Not a dicky bird, said Bagman comfortably. But she'll turn up, poor old Bertha, in memory like a leaky cauldron and no sense of direction. Lost, you take my word for it. She'll wander back into the office sometime in October, thinking it's still July. You don't think it might be time to send someone to look for her? Mr. Weasley suggested tentatively as Percy handed Mr. Bagman his tea. Barty Crouch keeps saying that, said Bagman, his round eyes widening innocently, but we really can't spare anyone at the moment. Oh, talk of the devil. Barty, a wizard, had just apparated at their fireside, and he could not have made more of a contrast with Ludo Bagman, sprawled on the grass in his old wasp robes. Barty Crouch was a stiff, upright, elderly man, dressed in an impeccably crisp suit and tie. The parting in his short grey hair was almost unnaturally straight, and his narrow toothbrush mustache looked as though he trimmed it using a slide rule. His shoes were highly polished. Violet could see at once why Percy idolized him. Percy was a great believer in rigidly followed rules, and Mr. Crouch had complied with the rule about Muggle dressing so thoroughly that he could have passed for a bank manager. Violet doubted even Uncle Vernon would have spotted him for what he really was. Pull up a bit of grass, Barty, said Ludo brightly, patting the ground beside him. No, thank you, Ludo, said Crouch, and there was a bite of impatience in his voice. I've been looking for you everywhere. The Bulgarians are insisting we add another 12 seats to the top box. Oh, is that what they're after? Said Bagman. I though the chap was asking to borrow a pair of tweezers, bit of a strong accent. Mr. Crouch, said Percy breathlessly, sunk in a kind of half-bow that made him look like a hunchback. Would you like a cup of tea? Oh, said Mr. Crouch, looking over at Percy in mild surprise. Yes, thank you, Weatherby. Fred and George choked into their own cups. Percy, very pink around the ears, busied himself with the kettle again. Oh, and I've been wanting a word with you too, Arthur, said Mr. Crouch, his sharp eyes falling upon Mr. Weasley. Ali Bashir's on the warpath. He wants a word with you about your embargo on flying carpets. Mr. Weasley heaved a deep sigh. I sent him an owl about that just last week. If I've told him once, I've told him 100 times. Carpets are defined as Muggle artifacts by the Registry of Proscribed Charmable Objects, but will he listen? I doubt it, said Mr. Crouch, accepting a cup from Percy. He's desperate to export here. Well, they'll never replace brooms in Britain, will they? Said Bagman. Ali thinks there's a niche in the market for a family vehicle, said Mr. Crouch. I remember my grandfather had an Axminster that could seat 12, but that was before carpets were banned, of course. He spoke as though he wanted to leave nobody in any doubt that all his ancestors had abided strictly by the law. So, been keeping busy, Barty, said Bagman breezily. Fairly, said Mr. Crouch dryly. Organizing portkeys across 5 continents is no mean feat, Ludo. I expect you'll both be glad when this is over, said Mr. Weasley. Ludo Bagman looked shocked. Glad, don't know when I've had more fun. Still, it's not as though we haven't got anything to look forward to, eh, Barty? Eh, plenty left to organize, eh? Mr. Crouch raised his eyebrows at Bagman. We agreed not to make the announcement until all the details. Oh, details, said Bagman, waving the word away like a cloud of midges. They've signed, haven't they? They've agreed, haven't they? I bet you anything these kids'll know soon enough anyway. I mean, it's happening at Hogwarts. Ludo, we need to meet the Bulgarians, you know, said Mr. Crouch sharply, cutting Bagman's remarks short. Thank you for the tea, Weatherby. He pushed his undrunk tea back at Percy and waited for Ludo to rise. Bagman struggled to his feet, swigging down the last of his tea, the gold in his pockets chinking merrily. See you all later, he said. You'll be up in the top box with me, I'm commentating, he waved. Barty Crouch nodded curtly, and both of them disapparated. What's happening at Hogwarts, Dad? Said Fred at once. What were they talking about? You'll find out soon enough, said Mr. Weasley, smiling. It's classified information until such time as the Ministry decides to release it, said Percy stiffly. Mr. Crouch was quite right not to disclose it. "Oh, shut up, Weatherby," said George. A sense of excitement rose like a palpable cloud over the campsite as the afternoon wore on. By dusk, the still summer air itself seemed to be quivering with anticipation, and as darkness spread like a curtain over the thousands of wading wizards, the last vestiges of pretense disappeared. The ministry seemed to have bowed to the inevitable and stopped fighting the signs of blatant magic now breaking out everywhere. Salesmen were apparating every few feet, carrying trays and pushing carts full of extraordinary merchandise. There were luminous roses green for Ireland, red for Bulgaria, which were squealing the names of the players, pointed green hats bedecked with shamrocks, Bulgarian scarves adorned with lions that really roared, flags from both countries that played their national anthems as they were waved. There were tiny models of firebolts that really flew, and collectible figures of famous players, which strolled across the palm of your hand, preening themselves. "You're for Ireland, right?" Violet said, rounding on Fred and George. The three of them and Ginny were strolling through the salesmen, looking over all the souvenirs. "How dare you?" said Fred in mock indignation. "It's not as if we've just bet our life savings on them or anything." Violet pursed her lips together. She disapproved of what the two of them had done, but had learned the hard way that money was a touchy subject among the Weasleys. It wasn't her place to criticize. Instead, she stopped in front of a cart piled high with what looked like brass binoculars, except they were covered with all sorts of weird knobs and dials. "What are these for?" she asked, picking up a pair. "Omnioculars," said the sales wizard eagerly. "You can replay action. Slow everything down, and they flash up a play-by-play breakdown if you need it. Bargain 10 galleons each." "4 pairs," said Violet firmly to the wizard. Fred, George, and Ginny sputtered behind her, but Violet turned and said, "I haven't got you anything for Christmas for the last 3 years. Consider this a make-up present." The twins looked likely to argue, but Violet pushed 2 pairs of omnioculars into their hands with a firm smile. Ginny had gone bright red again. "Thanks, Roman 6, she muttered, clutching them tightly. "Don't mention it," Violet said kindly. By the time they went back to the tents, Violet's money bag was considerably lighter. In addition to the omnioculars, she'd also bought herself a green rosette and a dancing shamrock hat for Ginny, whose face was now the color of tomato, though she was smiling broadly. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all decked out in green as well, and Mr. Weasley was carrying an Irish flag. And then a deep, booming gong sounded somewhere beyond the woods, and at once green and red lanterns blazed to light in the trees, lighting a path to the field. "It's time," said Mr. Weasley, looking as excited as any of them. "Come on, let's go." Chapter 4. The Quidditch World Cup. Clutching their purchases, Mr. Weasley in the lead, they all hurried into the wood, following the lantern-lit trail. They could hear the sounds of thousands of people moving around them, shouts and laughter, snatches of singing. The atmosphere of feverish excitement was highly infectious. Violet couldn't stop grinning. They walked through the wood for 20 minutes, talking and joking loudly, until at last they emerged on the other side and found themselves in the shadow of gigantic stadium. Though Violet could see only a fraction of the immense gold walls surrounding the field, she could tell that 10 cathedrals would fit comfortably inside it. "Seats 100,000, said Mr. Weasley, spotting the awestruck look on all of their faces. "Ministry task force of 500 have been working on it all year. Muggle-repelling charms on every inch of it. Every time Muggles have got anywhere near here all year, they've suddenly remembered urgent appointments and had to dash away again. Bless them," he added fondly, leading the way toward the nearest entrance, which was already surrounded by a swarm of shouting witches and wizards. "Prime tickets," said the ministry witch at the entrance when she checked their tickets. "Top box. Straight upstairs, Arthur, and as high as you can go." The stairs into the stadium were carpeted in rich purple. They clambered upward with the rest of the crowd, which slowly filtered away through doors into the stands to their left and right. Mr. Weasley's party kept climbing, and at last they reached the top of the staircase. and found themselves in a small box, set at the highest point of the stadium and situated exactly halfway between the golden goal posts. About 20 purple and gilt chairs stood in 2 rows here, and Violet, filing into the front seats with the Weasleys, looked down upon a scene the likes of which she could never have imagined. 100,000 witches and wizards were taking their places in the seats, which rose in levels around the long oval field. Everything was suffused with a mysterious golden light, which seemed to come from the stadium itself. At either end of the field stood 3 goal hoops, 50 feet high. Right opposite them, almost at Violet's eye level, was a gigantic blackboard. Gold writing kept dashing across it, as though an invisible giant's hand was scrawling upon the blackboard and then wiping it off again. Watching it, Violet saw that it was flashing advertisements across the field. The Blue Bottle, a broom for all the family, safe, reliable, and with built-in anti-burglar buzzer. Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover. No pain, no stain. Gladrag's Wizardwear London, Paris, Hogsmeade. Violet tore her eyes away from the sign and looked over her shoulder to see who else was sharing the box with them. So far it was empty, except for a tiny creature sitting in the second from last seat at the end of the row behind them. The creature, whose legs were so short they stuck out in front of it on the chair, was wearing a tea towel draped like a toga, and it had its face hidden in its hands. Yet those long, bat-like ears were oddly familiar. Violet stared, mouth agape, then leaned over and tugged on Harry's sleeve. Harry, who was busy joking with Ron, looked around curiously and followed the line of where she pointed. "Darby," said Harry incredulously. The tiny creature looked up and stretched its fingers, revealing enormous brown eyes and a nose the exact size and shape of a large tomato. It wasn't Darby, it was, however, unmistakably a house elf, as Harry's friend Darby had been. 2 years ago, Harry had set Darby free from the family that kept him enslaved, the Malfoys. "Did Sir just call me Darby?" squeaked the elf curiously from between its fingers. Its voice was higher even than Darby's had been, a teeny, quivering squeak of a voice, and Violet suspected, though it was very hard to tell with a house elf, that this one might just be female. Ron and Hermione spun around in their seats to look. Though Harry had likely told them all about Darby, they had never actually met him. Even Mr. Weasley looked around in interest. "Sorry," Harry told the elf. "I just thought you were someone I knew." "But I knows Darby too, sir," squeaked the elf. She was shielding her face, as though blinded by light, though the top box was not brightly lit. "My name is Winky, sir, and you, sir." Her dark brown eyes widened to the size of side plates as they rested upon Harry's scar. "You is surely Harry Potter." Of course, even a house elf would know Harry by his scar, Violet thought, surprised by her own bitterness. But it would make sense, she supposed. Only old and wealthy wizarding families were said to own house elves. Surely they would speak of her and Harry, and the elves would overhear. Harry must not have thought of that, judging by the stunned look on his face. "Yeah, I am," he said. "But Darby talks of you all the time, sir," Winky said, lowering her hands very slightly and looking awestruck. "How is he?" Harry asked. "How's freedom suiting him?" "Ah, sir," said Winky, shaking her head. "Ah, sir, meaning no disrespect, sir, but I is not sure you did Darby a favour, sir, when you is setting him free." "Why?" said Violet, taken aback. "What's wrong with him? Freedom is going to Darby's head, ma'am," said Winky sadly. "Ideas above his station. Ma'am can't get another position, ma'am." "Why not?" said Harry. Winky lowered her voice by a half-octave and whispered, "He is wanting paying for his work, sir." "Paying?" said Harry blankly. "Well, why shouldn't he be paid?" Winky looked quite horrified at the idea and closed her fingers slightly so that her face was half hidden again. "House elves is not paid, sir," she said in a muffled squeak. "No, no, no. I says to Darby, I says, go find yourself a nice family and settle down, Darby. He's getting up to all sorts of high jinks, ma'am, what is unbecoming to a house elf. You goes racketing around like, Darby, I said, and next thing I hear you's up in front of the Department for the Regulation of Magical Creatures, like some common goblin." "Well, it's about time he had a bit of fun," said Harry. House elves is not supposed to have fun, Harry Potter, said Winky firmly, from behind her hands. House elves do what they is told. I is not liking heights at all, Harry Potter. She glanced toward the edge of the box and shuddered, but my master sends me to the top box, and I come, sir. Why's he sent you up here, if he knows you don't like heights? Said Violet, frowning. Master wants me to save him a seat, ma'am. He is very busy, said Winky, tilting her head toward the empty space beside her. Winky is wishing she is back in Master's tent, ma'am, but Winky does what she is told. Winky is a good house elf. She gave the edge of the box another frightened look and hid her eyes completely again. Harry and Violet turned back to the others. So that's a house elf, Ron muttered. Weird things, aren't they? Darby was weirder, said Harry. They're not weird, Violet said fervently. Don't be mean. The boys at least had the decency to look apologetic before turning away. Violet sat back in her seat with a huff. Ron pulled out his omnioculars and started testing them, staring down into the crowd on the other side of the stadium. Wild, he said, twiddling the replay knob on the side. I can make that old bloke down there pick his nose again, and again, and again. Hermione, meanwhile, was skimming eagerly through her velvet-covered, tasseled program. A display from the team mascots will precede the match, she read aloud. Oh, that's always worth watching, said Mr. Weasley. National teams bring creatures from their native land, to put on a bit of a show. The box gradually filled around them over the next half hour. Mr. Weasley kept shaking hands with people who were obviously very important wizards. Percy jumped to his feet so often that he looked as though he were trying to sit on a hedgehog. When Cornelius Fudge appeared, the Minister of Magic himself, Percy bowed so low that his glasses fell off and shattered. Highly embarrassed, he repaired them with his wand and thereafter remained in his seat, throwing jealous looks at Harry and Violet, whom Cornelius Fudge had greeted like old friends. They had met before, and Fudge shook both of their hands in a fatherly fashion, asked how they were, and introduced them to the wizards on either side of him. The Potter twins, he loudly told the Bulgarian minister, who was wearing splendid robes of black velvet trimmed with gold and didn't seem to understand a word of English. Potters. Oh, come on now, you know who they are. The ones who survived, you know who. You know who he is. The Bulgarian wizard suddenly spotted Harry's scar and startling gabbling loudly and excitedly, pointing at it. Knew we'd get there in the end, Fudge said wearily to Violet. I'm not a great shake at languages. I need Barty Crouch for this sort of thing. Ah, I see his house. Elf saving him a seat. Good job, too. These Bulgarian blighters have been trying to cadge all the best places. Ah, and here's Lucius. Harry, Violet, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny, who was sitting on Violet's other side, turned quickly. Edging along the second row to 3 still empty seats right behind Mr. Weasley were none other than Darby the house elf's former owners, Lucius Malfoy, his son, Draco, and a woman Violet supposed must be Draco's mother. The Potter twins and Draco Malfoy had been enemies ever since their first journey to Hogwarts. A pale boy with a pointed face and white blonde hair, Draco greatly resembled his father. His mother was blonde too, tall and slim. She would have been very beautiful if she hadn't been wearing a look that suggested there was a nasty smell under her nose. Ah, fudge, said Mr. Malfoy, holding out his hand as he reached for the Minister of Magic. How are you? I don't think you've met my wife, Narcissa, or our son, Draco. How do you do, said Fudge, smiling and bowing to Mrs. Malfoy. And allow me to introduce to you to Mr. Oblansk Oberlansk Mister. Well, he's the Bulgarian Minister of Magic, and he can't understand a word I'm saying anyway, so never mind. And let's see who else you know. Arthur Weasley, I dare say. It was a tense moment. Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy looked at each other, and Violet vividly recalled the last time they had come face to face. It had been in Flourish and Blott's bookshop, and they had had a fight. Mr. Malfoy's cold grey eyes swept over Mr. Weasley and then up and down the row. Good Lord, Arthur, he said softly. What did you have to sell to get seats in the top box? Surely your house wouldn't have fetched this much. Fudge, who wasn't listening, said, Lucius has just given a very generous contribution to St. Mungo's Hospital to magical maladies and injuries, Arthur. He's here as my guest. How nice, said Mr. Weasley, with a very strained smile. Mr. Malfoy's eyes had returned to Hermione, who went slightly pink, but stared determinedly back at him. Violet knew exactly what was making Mr. Malfoy's lip curl like that. The Malfoys prided themselves on being purebloods. In other words, they considered anyone of Muggle descent, like Hermione, second class. However, under the gaze of the Minister of Magic, Mr. Malfoy didn't dare say anything. He nodded sneeringly to Mr. Weasley and continued down the line to his seats. Draco shot Harry, Ron, and Hermione one contemptuous look, then caught the way Violet was glaring at him and settled himself between his mother and father. Harry liked to talk about Draco Malfoy as though he were his problem, but Harry wasn't the one who had to share a common room and almost all classes with him. Violet and Draco were both in Slytherin House and had had plenty of confrontations of their own over the years. Violet was rather pleased to see that Draco still remembered what a bad idea crossing her could be. I can't believe he's here as a guest of the minister, Ginny muttered angrily, once they had all turned back around to face the field. No wonder the Malfoys can get away with whatever they like. Violet remembered, quite suddenly, that Ginny had more reason to hate Lucius Malfoy than almost anyone else. It had been him, after all, who had slipped a mysterious diary into her belongings 2 years ago. The diary had belonged to Tom Riddle, the young man who would eventually become Lord Voldemort, and was somehow imbued with some of his power and personality. In Ginny's possession, the diary had warped her mind and controlled her and very nearly got her killed. All of that was thanks to Lucius Malfoy. Bastard, Violet muttered to Ginny, who giggled into her hand. Next moment, Ludo Bagman charged into the box. Everyone ready, he said, his round face gleaming like a great, excited Edom. Minister ready to go. Ready when you are, Ludo, said Fudge comfortably. Ludo whipped out his wand, placed the tip of against his own throat, and said sonorous, and then spoke over the roar of sound that was now filling the packed stadium. His voice echoed over them, booming into every corner of the stands. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the final of the 422nd Quidditch World Cup, the spectators screamed and clapped. Thousands of flags waved, adding their discordant national anthems to the racket. The huge blackboard opposite them was wiped clear of its last message, Bertie Bart's every flavor beans a risk with every mouthful, and now showed Bulgaria, 0, Ireland, 0. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce the Bulgarian national team mascots. The right-hand side of the stands, which was a solid block of scarlet, roared its approval. I wonder what they've brought, said Mr. Weasley, leaning forward in his seat. Ah, he suddenly whipped off his glasses and polished them hurriedly on his robes. Vila. What a veal! But 100 Vila were now gliding out onto the field, and Violet's question was answered for her. Vila were women, the most beautiful women Violet had ever seen. Except that they couldn't be human. This puzzled Violet for a moment while she tried to guess what exactly they could be. What could make their skin shine moon-bright like that, or their white gold hair fan out behind them without wind? But then the music started, and Violet stopped worrying about them not being human. In fact, she stopped worrying about anything at all. The Vila had started to dance, and Violet's mind had gone completely and blissfully blank. All that mattered in the world was that she kept watching the Vila, because if they stopped dancing, terrible things would happen. And as the Vila danced faster and faster, half-formed thoughts started chasing through Violet's dazed mind. She wanted to do something very impressive right now. She was very good at magic. Maybe she could do some big magic, something really bright, and get the Vila's attention from all the way at the top box. Harry, what are you doing? Said Hermione's voice from a long way off. The music stopped. Violet blinked. She was on the edge of her seat, one hand out in front of her, her palm tingling slightly but beside her, Harry was on his feet with one of his legs resting on the wall of the barks, as though he meant to step over the edge of it. Next to him, Ran was frozen in an attitude that looked as though he were about to dive from a springboard. Angry yells were filling the stadium. The crowd didn't want the Vila to go. Violet was with them. She would, of course, be supporting Bulgaria, and she wondered vaguely why she had ever thought otherwise. Ran, meanwhile, was absent-mindedly shredding the shamrocks on his hat. Mr. Weasley, smiling slightly, leaned over to Ran and tugged the hat out his hands. "You'll be wanting that," he said, "once Ireland have had their say." "Ha!" said Ron. Hermione made a loud tutting noise. She reached up and pulled Harry back into his seat. "Honestly, can you believe the fuss they're making? Violet, Violet." "What?" said Violet. She tore her eyes away from the Vila, who were now lined up along one side of the field, and looked down at Hermione and Mr. Weasley. They were both looking at her rather curiously. Violet realized she was still perched eagerly on the edge of her seat and sat back at once, so hard she nearly knocked the wind out of herself. Her face felt very hot, and her stomach felt very queasy. "And now," roared Ludo Bagman's voice, "kindly put your wands in the air." For the Irish national team mascots. Next moment, what seemed to be a great green and gold comet came zooming into the stadium. It did one circuit of the stadium, then split into two smaller comets, each hurtling toward the goal posts. A rainbow arced suddenly across the field, connecting the two balls of light. The crowd oohed and ahed as though at a fireworks display. Now the rainbow faded, and the balls of light reunited and merged. They had formed a great shimmering shamrock, which rose up into the sky and began to soar over the stands. Something like golden rain seemed to be falling from it. "Excellent," yelled Ran as the shamrock soared over them, and heavy gold coins rained from it, bouncing off their heads and seats. Squinting up at the shamrock, Violet realized that it was actually comprised of thousands of tiny little bearded men with red vests, each carrying a minute lamp of gold or green. "Leprechauns," said Mr. Weasley over the tumultuous applause of the crowd. Many of them were still fighting and rummaging around under their chairs to retrieve the gold. "There you go," Ron yelled happily, stuffing a fistful of gold coins into Harry's hands. "For the omnioculars. Now you've got to buy me a Christmas present." "Ha!" The great shamrock dissolved. The leprechauns drifted down onto the field on the opposite side from the Vila and settled themselves cross-legged to watch the match. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome the Bulgarian national Quidditch team. I give you Dimitrov." A scarlet-clad figure on a broomstick, moving so fast it was blurred, shot out onto the field from an entrance far below, to wild applause from the Bulgarian supporters. Ivanova, a second scarlet-robed player, zoomed out. "Zagraf, Levski, Volchanov, Volkov, Airy and Crumb." That's him," yelled Ron, following Crumb with his omnioculars. Violet quickly focused her own. Victor Crumb was thin, dark, and sallow-skinned, with a large curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He looked like an overground bird of prey. It was hard to believe Crumb was only 18. "And now, please greet the Irish national Quidditch team," yelled Bagman. "Presenting Connolly, Ryan, Troy, Mullet, Morgan, Quigley, Ayr and Lynch." 7 green blurs swept onto the field. Violet cheered at the top of her lungs along with the whole row of Weasleys. She had little personal investment in either team, but it was impossible not to be swept up in the fervor. And here, all the way from Egypt, our referee, acclaimed chairwizard of the International Association of Quidditch, Hassan Mostafa. A small and skinny wizard, completely bald but with a mustache to rival Uncle Vernon's, wearing robes of pure gold to match the stadium, strode out onto the field. A silver whistle was protruding from under the mustache, and he was carrying a large crate under one arm, his broomstick under the other. Violet held up her omnioculars and watched as Mostafa mounted his broomstick and kicked the crate open. 4 balls burst into the air. The scarlet quaffle, the 2 black bludgers, and Violet saw it for the briefest moment before it sped out of sight. The minuscule, winged golden snitch. With a sharp blast on his whistle, Mostafa shot into the air after the bowls. "You're off," screamed Bagman. "And it's Mullet, Troy, Morin, Dimitrov, back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Morin." It was Quidditch as Violet had never seen it played before. She hardly knew where to keep her omnioculars fixed. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to one another so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Violet was doing her best to follow the quaffle, but all the flickering around was starting to make her feel dizzy. She lowered her omnioculars to rub at her eyes, and Troy scores, roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with a roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 to Ireland. "I missed it," Violet cried, immediately raising her omnioculars again. She fiddled with the dials, but as she hadn't had them pointed at the field, all she got was a blur of movement and a close-up of her own shoe. She cursed under her breath and looked quickly back to the field. Troy was doing a lap of honor. On the sidelines, the leprechauns had all risen into the air again and formed the great, glittering shamrock. Across the field, the Vila were watching them sulkily. Annoyed with herself, Violet pressed the omnioculars firmly into her face. Violet knew enough about Quidditch from watching Harry play to see that the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, their movements so well coordinated that they appeared to be reading one another's minds as they positioned themselves. And within 10 minutes, Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead 30-0 and causing a thunderous ride of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. The match became still faster, but more brutal. Volkov and Volchanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then, finally, Ivanova managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper, Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Fingers in your ears," bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila stared to dance in celebration. Violet slammed her eyes shut and clapped both hands over her ears, not wanting to embarrass herself any more than she already had. The last thing she wanted was for Draco Malfoy to see the kind of affect the Vila had on her, especially when they didn't seem to bother Hermione and Ginny at all. After a few seconds, Violet chanced a glance at the field. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria was again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova, oh I say," roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards screamed as the two seekers, Crumb and Lunch, plummeted through the center of the chasers, so fast that it looked as though they had just jumped from airplanes without parachutes. Violet followed their descent through her omnioculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash," screamed Hermione down the line. She was half right at the very last second. Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiraled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Fool," moaned Mr. Weasley. Crumb was fainting. "It's timeout," yelled Bagman's voice, as trained Mediwizards hurry onto the field to examine Aidan Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got plowed," Charlie said, reassuring to Ginny, who had launched out of her seat beside Violet and was now hanging over the side of the box, looking horror-struck. Which is what Crumb was after, of course. Violet hastily raised her omnioculars and focused down on the field, where Lynch was being revived by Mediwizards with cups of potion. She searched for Crumb and found him circling high above the field, his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time while Lynch was revived to look out for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last, to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his broom, and kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland new heart. When Mostafa blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with a skill unrivaled by anything Violet had seen so far. As Mullet shot toward the goal posts yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm, the Bulgarian keeper, Zalgraf, flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly Violet didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd, and Mustafa's long, shrill whistle blast told her it had been a foul. And Mustafa takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for carving excessive use of elbows, Bagman informed the roaring spectators. And yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words, "Ha, ha, ha." The Vila on the other side of the field leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. Violet wasn't quick enough to stuff her ears this time. The music started up, and the Vila started dancing, and the roars of the crowd faded away into nothingness as the beauty of the Vila's movement began to cloud her mind. If only they could keep dancing forever. Then things would really be all right in the world. But the Vila did not keep dancing. The music came to an abrupt, discordant end as they were shouted down by the referee, each of their stunning faces twisted in anger. Violet came back to herself in a rush of mortified self-awareness. And unless I'm much mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots, said Bagman's voice. Now there is something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty. To try and cover the blush in her cheeks, Violet clutched her omnioculars back to her face. It was indeed turning nasty. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volchanov, landed on either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating toward the leprechauns, who had now gleefully formed the words, "he, he, he." Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his finger into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again, and when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. 2 penalties for Ireland, shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. And Volkov and Volchanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go. And Troy takes the quaffle. Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volchanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with bludger or human as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Morin, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, all standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. Dimitrov skins Morin deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty, yes. There's the whistle. The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed at the Vila across the field. At this, the Vila lost control. Instead of dancing, they launched themselves across the field and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through her omnioculars, Violet saw that their beauty had shifted into something far more obviously inhuman, their faces elongated into sharp, cruel-beaked bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. "Anthat, boys," yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the leprechauns, but with little success. While Violet's were fixed on the chaos below, her ears were attuned to the commentary on the pitched battle happening above. Bagman was shouting off names faster than ever. Levksy, Dimitrov, Morin, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Morin again, Morin scores. But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila, the blasts now issuing from the ministry members' wands, and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. Violet wrenched her gaze skyward as the game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov, the Irish beater, quickly swung heavily at a passing bludger and hit it as hard as possible toward Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him full in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose looked broken, there was blood everywhere, but Hassan Mustafa didn't blow his whistle. He had become distracted, and Violet couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broom tail alight. "Time out," yelled Ron's voice. "Ah, come on, he can't play like that. Look at him. Look at Lynch," Harry yelled. for the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Violet scrambled to keep her omnioculars fixed on him. "He's seen the snitch," Harry shouted beside her. "He's seen it. Look at him go." Half the crowd seemed to have realized what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in another great wave of green, screaming their seeker on. But Crumb was on his tail. How he could see where he was going, Violet had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch now as the pair of them hurtled toward the ground again. "They're going to crash," shrieked Ginny. "They're not," roared Ron. "Lynch is," yelled Harry, and he was right for the second time. Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Vila. "The snitch, where's the snitch?" bellowed Charlie from Ginny's other side. "He's got it, Crumb's got it, it's all over," shouted Harry. Crumb, his red robes shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing Bulgaria, 160 Ireland, 170 across the crowd, who didn't seem to have realized what had happened. Then, slowly, as though a great jumbo jet engine were revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and lower and erupted into screams of delight. "Ireland wins," Bagman shouted, who, like the Irish, seemed to be taken aback by the sudden end of the match. "Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins, good Lord. I don't think any of us were expecting that." "What'd he catch the snitch for?" Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. "He ended it when Ireland were 160 points ahead, the idiot." "He knew they were never going to catch up," Harry shouted, his voice carrying through even over all the noise. "The Irish chasers were too good. He wanted to end it on his terms, that's all." "Is he going to be all right?" Ginny asked, rushing to look over the edge of the box again, as a swarm of Mediwizards blasted a path through the battling Vila and leprechauns to get to Crumb. "He looks a terrible mess." It was hard to see what was happening below, because leprechauns were zooming delightedly all over the field, but Violet could just make out Crumb, surrounded by Mediwizards. He looked surlier than ever and refused to let them mop him up. His team members were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully in a shower of gold descending from their mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium. The Irish national anthem blared from all sides. The Vila were shrinking back into their beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. "Well, we fought bravely," said a gloomy voice behind Violet. She looked around. It was the Bulgarian Prime Minister. "You can speak English," said Fudge, sounding outraged, "and you've been letting me mime everything all day." "Well, it was very funny," said the Bulgarian minister, shrugging. And as the Irish team performs a lap of honor, flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box. Violet's eyes were suddenly dazzled by a blinding white light as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see the inside. Squinting toward the entrance, she saw two panting wizards carrying a vast golden cup into the box, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was still looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. "Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers Bulgaria," Bagman shouted, and up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgarian players. The crowd below was applauding appreciatively. Violet could see thousands and thousands of omniocular lenses flashing and winking their directing, and felt immediately sick to her stomach. The thought of so many eyes on her made her nauseous. One by one, the Bulgarians filed between the rows of seats in the box, and Bagman called out the name of each as they shook hands with their own minister and then with Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch. Violet noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered. But when Crumb's name was announced, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Aidan Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly. The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused. But he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air, and the crowd below thundered its approval. Violet's hands were numb with clapping. At least, when the Irish team had left the barks to perform another lap of honor on their brooms, Aidan Lynch on the back of Connolly's, clutching hard around his waist and still grinning in a bemused sort of way. Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and muttered, "Quietus. They'll be talking about this one for years," he said hoarsely. "A really unexpected twist, that. Shame it couldn't have lasted longer. Ah, yes. Yes, I owe you. How much?" For Fred and George had just scrambled over the backs of their seats and were standing in front of Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces, their hands outstretched.